Hey guys! So, tonight we're going to drift far away, back almost 2,000 years, to a windswept frontier where the Roman Empire decided it had finally had enough of conquering things. Imagine that, Rome, the eternal city, suddenly saying, "Yeah, I think we'll stop here. No thanks, Scotland." That's where Hadrian's Wall comes in. A line of stone and turf stretched across the narrow neck of northern Britain. It wasn't just a wall, though. It was a statement. It was Rome planting a giant stone post-it note that said, "We are Rome. Do not mess with us. Also, please stay out." And tonight, we're not going to talk about battles or great generals or political treaties. Nope. We're just going to sit here at the edge of the world, with the soldiers, their families, the local villagers, and all the odd little characters who somehow ended up living beside this wall. Because that's where the real stories are, the small, human ones. And, conveniently, the very boring ones. Which, of course, makes them perfect bedtime material. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Pretend you're sitting by a smoky little Roman oil lamp in a drafty barracks. Outside, the Northumbrian wind is howling, but inside, it's just us and the steady march of history that, honestly, wasn't going anywhere very fast up here. Hadrian's Wall wasn't glamorous. Let's be honest. When most people think of Rome, they imagine golden marble, triumphal arches, and senators in togas dramatically stabbing each other. But the northern frontier, not so much. This was mud, rain, sheep, the constant smell of damp socks. The Emperor Hadrian himself visited around the year 122 CE. He looked at this corner of Britain, green hills, boggy marshes, people with suspicious hairstyles, and decided, yeah, that's enough empire for me. So he ordered the wall. Not really to keep barbarians out, more to keep the Romans in line. To say, here's the border. Don't get ideas. The wall stretched about 73 miles. Which sounds impressive, until you realize it was basically Rome's version of a picket fence. Except instead of painting it white, they carved it out of stone and filled it with men who hadn't bathed properly in months. At regular intervals, they built forts, mile castles, and little turrets. Imagine a child's Lego set, but with more latrines. Each fort was like a small town. Barracks, stables, workshops, granaries, even bathhouses, because if there's one thing Romans couldn't live without, it was sitting in lukewarm communal soup water while complaining about the weather. And the weather was terrible. That's the one thing every ancient source agrees on. The Roman historian Hadrian basically says the local climate was a nightmare. Cold, rainy, windy. Which makes sense, because Britain is still like that 2,000 years later. Some things never change. Now, picture yourself as an ordinary soldier stationed here. You're not glamorous. You're not fighting in epic battles. You're mostly digging ditches, repairing walls, and staring at sheep for hours. The Roman legions weren't even the ones stationed on the wall. They had auxiliary troops here, recruits from all over the empire. Syrians, Spaniards, Gauls, even men from North Africa. Imagine moving from the deserts of modern Algeria to Newcastle. Talk about culture shock. One minute you're in sun-baked Timgad, the next you're standing ankle-deep in English mud wondering why the sky never stops leaking. But life was structured. Roman discipline was tight. You woke up early. Trumpet call, roll out of bed, strap on your armor, and then begin another glamorous day of wall maintenance. Maybe a patrol. Maybe kitchen duty. Maybe watching some drunk villager throw rocks at the wall and pretending it's an invasion. Pay wasn't great either. Soldiers technically earned a steady wage, but it was often docked for food, equipment, or whatever scheme the centurion was running that month. So if you thought modern paycheck deductions were bad, at least you're not a Roman auxiliary whose salary mysteriously vanishes because the commander needed another statue of Jupiter. And yet, it wasn't all miserable. There were small comforts. The army knew how to make life bearable, even on the edge of nowhere. Forts had little taverns, sometimes even inns. Traders set up shops just outside the gates. You could buy imported wine, at a ridiculous markup, of course, or maybe some olive oil, a touch of home for the men from the Mediterranean. And food. Oh, the food was weird. Roman soldiers here had a diet that mixed the empire with the local landscape. On one hand, they got wheat bread, olive oil, and garum fish sauce shipped from the south. On the other, they had local venison, beer, and turnips. Lots of turnips. Nothing says imperial frontier like eating turnip stew every single night. Archaeologists have even found writing tablets from Vindolanda, one of the forts along the wall. They're basically the Roman version of post-it notes. Shopping lists, duty rosters, and even invitations to birthday parties. One famous note is from Claudia Severa, inviting her friend Sulpicia Lepidina to her birthday. It's the oldest surviving handwriting by a woman in Latin that we know of. And what does it say? Please come to my birthday. It will be nice. See? Some things don't change. Even on the frontier, people just wanted cake and company. But let's not romanticize too much. These forts were cramped, smelly, and loud. Barracks jammed with dozens of men. Fires smoking in the corner. Armor clanking. Someone always snoring. And outside, the rain tapping endlessly on the wooden roofs. Perfect ambience, really, if you're trying to fall asleep right now. And of course, there was the constant reminder, you were very far from home. Most of these soldiers were serving 25-year terms. That's basically a life sentence. Sure, you'd get Roman citizenship at the end, if you survived, but in the meantime, you were stuck patching walls and eating boiled cabbage. Still, somehow, the wall became its own little world. A mix of cultures, languages, and traditions, all held together by stone and discipline. Syrians building altars to their desert gods next to shrines for Jupiter. Local Britons trading wool and cattle with soldiers from Gaul. A strange, sleepy melting pot, perched at the edge of Rome's ambition. And here's the thing, for all the drama historians love to imagine, life on Hadrian's Wall was mostly uneventful. No epic battles every day. No hordes smashing through the gates. Just long stretches of nothing. Watching clouds drift. Repairing a section of stonework. Writing a letter home that might never arrive. Which, if you think about it, is exactly why it makes such a good bedtime story. Because this wasn't a life of high action. It was a life of waiting. Of standing guard while the wind howled across the moors. Of finding small joys in a bowl of warm stew or a letter from a friend. A rhythm that lulled people into a kind of quiet resignation. And now, as we let the torchlight flicker across the wall's ancient stones, let's drift further into this world. Into the mess halls and the cramped beds. Into the kitchens and marketplaces. Into the slow heartbeat of Rome, beating softly in the cold north. Because, honestly, if there's one thing Hadrian's Wall teaches us, it's that even empires, at the height of their power, sometimes just stopped. They sat down, built a wall, and decided, this is far enough. And isn't that the perfect note to fall asleep on? So, let's settle back down on the damp wooden floor of a Roman barracks along Hadrian's Wall. Imagine the smell of old leather, wet cloaks, and yesterday's cabbage stew lingering in the air. That, my friends, is the perfume of empire. Daily life here was, well, let's call it predictable. Which is a polite way of saying, extremely boring. But boring is good for us, because boring history makes excellent bedtime history. The Roman army had a very strict rhythm. And rhythm is important when you're trying to get through 25 years of service without losing your mind. Soldiers woke up to the blare of a cornu, that big Roman horn that basically sounded like a cow with bronchitis. It was loud, it was irritating, and it meant, time to get up, no excuses. From there, you cleaned up your gear. The Romans were obsessed with order. Polished armor, sharpened weapons, everything inspected by the centurion, who was basically the grumpy dad of the unit. If your sword looked dull, or your boots were muddy, congratulations, you just earned yourself extra ditch-digging duty. And nobody wanted that. Breakfast wasn't glamorous. A hunk of bread. Maybe some porridge. If you were lucky, a splash of sour wine to wash it down. Romans were not morning coffee people. Which honestly explains a lot about their constant crankiness. After that, it was drill time. Marching in formation, practicing maneuvers, sometimes building practice camps. Because nothing says fun morning workout like carrying giant logs while your commander yells about Roman glory. But here's the thing, most of the soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall weren't doing glorious combat training every day. They were construction workers, and maintenance staff, and amateur plumbers. They were assigned to repair walls, dig ditches, lay roads, build aqueducts, and generally keep the infrastructure from falling apart in the eternal damp. If you've ever had to fix a leaky roof while it's raining, congratulations. You already understand the daily suffering of a Roman auxiliary in Britain. And then, there were the guard shifts. Long hours standing on top of the wall, looking out across endless moorland. Sometimes you saw a wandering local farmer. Sometimes a sheep. Occasionally, a raiding party from the north would actually show up, but let's be honest, most of the time it was just mist, sheep, and more mist. Imagine standing in the cold, wrapped in a scratchy wool cloak, trying to stay awake while the wind screamed in your ears. That was your day. Over, and over, and over again. Of course, soldiers weren't robots. They had downtime, too. After drills and guard shifts, they relaxed in the barracks, or tried to. Cards, dice, gossip. Gambling was huge. And illegal. But also completely ignored, because the commanders were usually gambling right alongside the troops. Some things never change. Letters home were another part of daily life. We know this thanks to the Vindolanda tablets again, little wooden postcards scribbled with ink. Men asking their families to send more socks. Yes, socks. It turns out the Roman army had a sock shortage crisis in northern Britain. And frankly, if you've ever been to northern England in February, you know socks are not optional. One soldier even begged for more underpants. Proof that even the mighty Roman army was brought low by laundry problems. Now, here's a fun detail. The army actually tried to recreate bits of Roman urban life out here. Each fort had a bathhouse. Which sounds glamorous, until you realize the water was usually freezing. Picture 30 sweaty men sitting in lukewarm soup water while complaining about the weather. That's not exactly the height of relaxation. But it was a way to feel civilized. There were also small shrines, little altars, and temples tucked into corners of the forts. Soldiers prayed for protection, safe shifts, or maybe just for the rain to stop. Spoiler, the gods never answered that last one. But life wasn't just soldiers. The forts were buzzing little communities. Traders set up stalls outside. Wives and girlfriends, technically not supposed to be there, but always present, lived nearby in little shanty towns. Children grew up playing in the mud outside the gates, half Roman, half local, bilingual in Latin and Celtic. Imagine being a kid and your playground is literally the edge of the Roman Empire. You're running between stone walls, sneaking into the kitchens for leftover bread, listening to soldiers tell stories of deserts and cities you can't even imagine. It must have been surreal. And yet, to them, it was just normal life. Dinner was the main meal. Soldiers gathered in the mess halls, eating stews of grain, vegetables, and whatever meat was available. Archaeology tells us they ate surprisingly well. Chicken bones, venison, oysters, even exotic imports like peppercorns from India. That's right, someone was shipping peppercorns all the way from India to northern England, just so a bored soldier could sprinkle them on his cabbage stew. But mostly, it was barley, beans, cheese, and more barley. Lots of barley. You could probably build a second wall out of the leftover barley mush. Evenings were quieter. Fires crackled. Men gambled with dice. Someone might sing a tune from home. In some forts, there were theaters for little plays, Roman slapstick comedies where actors wore ridiculous masks and made fart jokes. Yes, the soldiers on Hadrian's Wall ended their days watching fart jokes in Latin. Civilization at its finest. And then came night watch. More shifts, more standing on the wall, more looking out at the dark hills. You might hear an owl. You might hear wolves. Or, if you were unlucky, a group of locals testing the defenses. But most nights, silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start inventing noises just to keep yourself awake. What's striking is just how ordinary it all was. These were not epic heroes. These were young men stuck in a remote corner of the empire, living on rations, doing chores, and hoping not to catch pneumonia. And yet, that's what made the empire work. Not the marble and the senators and the triumphs, but the endless, grinding daily lives of men standing in the rain, holding the line, because the emperor said so. It's almost meditative, really. The repetition, the routines, the sameness of it all. Wake up, drill, repair, eat, guard, sleep, repeat. 25 years of this, until you were too old to care. And maybe, just maybe, you walked away with citizenship, a little pension, and a permanent dislike of turnips. And as we sit with them tonight, in their cramped wooden barracks, listening to the snores of 50 men packed into a room with no windows, the candlelight flickering on damp stone, it's easy to see how the rhythm of daily life lulled them into a strange acceptance. Because sometimes history isn't about battles or emperors. Sometimes it's about socks, soup, and surviving another rainy day on the edge of the world. Now, if there's one thing that keeps soldiers anywhere in history going, it isn't glory. It isn't duty. It's food. You can lecture men about Rome's eternal destiny all day long, but if the stew pot is empty, your empire isn't making it very far. So let's wander into the kitchens of Hadrian's Wall. Imagine the smoky haze of a wood fire, the smell of barley boiling in big clay pots, and a cook who has absolutely had enough of life. Roman soldiers technically had standardized rations. Grain, mostly. The army issued wheat or barley. Each man was expected to grind it himself with a little hand mill, then bake bread or make porridge. Imagine finishing a 12-hour shift on guard duty and then having to go grind your own dinner. Welcome to Roman luxury living. But soldiers being soldiers, shortcuts were invented. You could pay a fellow soldier, or more likely some local woman in the civilian settlement, to grind it for you. The army loved efficiency, but the soldiers loved outsourcing even more. And then there were the add-ons. Salted pork, dried beans, onions, garlic. Archaeologists have found piles of animal bones near the forts. Cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, even chicken. Which means yes, the soldiers had Sunday roasts, Roman style. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hearty, and sometimes, surprisingly fancy. From the Vindolanda tablets, we know officers requested things like oysters. Yes, oysters. Because nothing screams northern frontier like sitting in the rain with a slimy shellfish. These had to be hauled in from the coast, packed in baskets of damp seaweed, then lugged all the way up to the wall so a centurion could impress his friends. Pepper also made it here. From India. Thousands of miles away. Tiny black grains carried across deserts, loaded onto ships, carted over mountains, eventually ending up sprinkled onto some poor soldier's boiled cabbage. Imagine being that peppercorn. You travel the entire known world only to die in a pot of soup on Hadrian's Wall. Tragic. Of course, the real treat was alcohol. Beer was common, brewed locally, frothy, and probably awful. The Romans looked down on beer, calling it a barbarian drink. But in northern Britain, wine was expensive, so beer it was. Soldiers drank it anyway, complaining the whole time, no doubt. Wine did arrive, imported from Gaul or Spain, packed in heavy clay amphorae. But by the time it made it this far north, it was often sour. Romans would cut it with water, or spice it with herbs and honey to cover the taste. So if you've ever had bad box wine, congratulations, you've just shared a cultural experience with Roman auxiliaries. Meals were social. Soldiers didn't eat alone. They gathered in contubernia, groups of 8 men who shared a tent or barracks room. Each little squad cooked and ate together, pooling rations, arguing over who had to do the grinding this time, and probably complaining about their centurion. Picture it, 8 tired men, huddled around a smoky fire, bowls in hand, chewing barley porridge and grumbling about socks. That was the true heartbeat of the wall. Not emperors. Not generals. Just 8 guys trying to get through another damp night with edible food. And it wasn't just the soldiers. The civilian settlements, those little towns that grew up outside every fort, were packed with taverns and food stalls. People sold bread, cheese, roasted meats, even sweet pastries. So yes, Roman soldiers could stumble out after guard duty and buy themselves a nice pie. Some things really never change. These villages were noisy, chaotic, and smelled like a mixture of beer, horse manure, and grilled meat. But they were alive. If you were stationed at the wall, they gave you a taste of home. Maybe a lover. Maybe a hot meal you didn't have to cook yourself. Maybe just a break from the endless parade of barley stew. Now, food wasn't only about survival. It was about identity. A Syrian soldier might crave spicy stews. A Spaniard might dream of olives. A North African might look longingly at a jar of garum, that fermented fish sauce Romans adored. If you've never had garum, imagine liquid anchovies that have been left to rot in the sun for months. Romans loved it. Locals probably hated it. But it was shipped in crates all the way up here anyway. Because heaven forbid a Roman soldier go without his stinky fish juice. Archaeologists actually found amphorae with garum residue along the wall. Which means yes, someone was hauling barrels of fermented fish all the way to northern England. Honestly, that might have been the real punishment of serving here. Not the cold. Not the long service. Just the smell of garum in the barracks. Let's not forget the little indulgences. Honey cakes. Fruit when available. Walnuts. Occasionally figs or dates brought up from the south. Officers had more access, of course. They could afford imported delicacies. Ordinary soldiers, not so much. But everyone got excited when something new showed up in camp. A shipment of apples. A barrel of better wine. Maybe a crate of olives. Tiny luxuries that broke the monotony. And speaking of luxuries, let's talk about bathhouses. Because somehow, even here in the bogs of Britain, Romans insisted on their baths. Every fort had one. Soldiers would shuffle in after a long day, strip down, and go through the ritual: warm room, hot room, cold plunge. Soap wasn't really a thing. They used olive oil, rubbed it onto their skin, then scraped it off with a little tool called a strigil. Imagine 50 men scraping oil and dirt off themselves in the same room. Relaxing? Debatable. Roman? Absolutely. Bathhouses were social hubs, too. Gossip, deals, even light gambling happened there. You could talk about the latest news from Rome while a guy next to you loudly complained about the cold plunge pool. Cozy. And then there were festivals. Romans loved a good excuse to party, and the wall was no exception. Saturnalia, in December, was a big one. Soldiers exchanged gifts, wore silly hats, and let the usual rules slide. For 1 week, the centurions played nice, and everyone pretended the cold wasn't slowly killing them. Imagine the barracks lit with extra lamps, soldiers singing half-drunken songs, kids from the villages running around with little clay toys. Even on the frontier, even in the rain, they made space for joy. So yes, life on Hadrian's wall was tough. The food was repetitive, the beer was bad, and the bathwater was probably lukewarm at best. But in the middle of it all, there were moments of comfort. A warm fire. A shared meal. A stolen pastry from a market stall. Tiny joys that made the endless rain a little more bearable. And honestly, that's what makes the story of the wall feel so human. Not the battles, not the emperors, but the everyday details. A soldier begging for more socks. An officer demanding oysters in the middle of a swamp. A child laughing as she bites into a honey cake at Saturnalia. Those little moments that say, yes, even here, life went on. And as we drift off tonight, let's imagine ourselves not as emperors or generals, but as one of those 8 men in a contubernium. Sitting around a fire. Bowl of barley stew in hand. Listening to the rain drum against the barracks roof. Someone tells a joke. Someone complains about the centurion again. And for a moment, in the middle of nowhere, life feels steady. Because sometimes, the greatest luxury isn't oysters or imported wine. It's just being warm, fed, and not on guard duty. So far, we've sat inside the forts, smoky barracks, soggy cloaks, and more barley stew than anyone should endure. But the wall wasn't just soldiers. It was also home to a whole shadow world of families, traders, and hangers-on. Because wherever the army goes, people follow. And Hadrian's wall was no exception. Technically, Roman soldiers weren't supposed to marry during their service. That's the official line. Rome liked the idea of its soldiers being unattached, disciplined, and free of family obligations. But, as usual, reality didn't care. Soldiers had partners, wives in everything but name, and plenty of children running around the fort's edges. Archaeologists have found toys near the wall, little dolls carved from bone, tiny wooden swords, even mini shoes sized for children's feet. Which means the place was not just men stomping around in hobnailed sandals. It was also kids laughing, crying, and generally making noise while their dads tried to look intimidating on guard duty. The settlements outside the forts were called vici. Imagine a sprawling cluster of wooden shacks, taverns, bathhouses, and workshops, all hugging the stone walls of the fort. These villages were messy, noisy, and alive. Traders selling bread, locals bargaining for wool, soldiers off duty wandering around half-drunk. In short, everything you'd expect from a Roman boomtown, except this one was planted in the soggy hills of Britain. And they weren't small. Some vici grew almost as large as the forts themselves. They had streets, drainage ditches, even little temples. You could buy food, gamble, get your clothes mended, or, if you had the coin, spend some time in an establishment we'll politely call the house of entertainment. Soldiers may have been far from Rome, but they weren't about to give up Roman leisure. The traders were a fascinating bunch. Many were locals, Britons who realized it was more profitable to sell bread and beer to Romans than to throw rocks at them. Others came from far away. Syrians selling incense, Gauls selling wine, North Africans bringing exotic spices. Hadrian's Wall became a melting pot not just of soldiers, but of entrepreneurs who knew an opportunity when they saw one. And they weren't just hawking food and luxuries. Blacksmiths set up shops, making nails, horseshoes, and spare bits of armor. Leatherworkers sold belts and sandals. Potters churned out cooking jars. Someone had to supply all those forts with the basics of daily life. The Roman military machine might have been powerful, but it still needed local economies to grease the gears. Religion was everywhere, too. Soldiers brought their gods with them, and so did the civilians. You'd find little altars at the edge of vici, one for Jupiter, another for Mithras, another for some obscure Syrian deity who was probably very confused to be worshipped in rainy Britain. Locals added their own Celtic gods into the mix. It was spiritual chaos, but in a strangely cooperative way. One shrine uncovered near the wall had dedications to Roman gods, local deities, and even river spirits. Because when you live in constant rain, you start making offerings to every water spirit you can think of, just in case. And then there were the families. The unofficial wives and children of soldiers made the wall feel less like a fortress and more like a small town. Women cooked, sold goods, raised children, and sometimes even acted as unofficial nurses for the garrisons. They weren't supposed to be part of the military system, but without them, life would have been much grimmer. Some officers even brought their entire households, slaves, servants, pets. Yes, pets. Archaeologists have found evidence of dogs at the forts, from little lapdogs to big mastiffs. Picture a tough-looking Roman officer walking around with a tiny fluffy dog under his arm. History is full of those little ironies. Now, let's not pretend civilian life was easy. The vici were muddy, smoky, and prone to flooding. Houses were simple wooden thatch affairs, with 1 or 2 rooms. Fires smoked constantly. Chickens and pigs wandered through the streets. And there was always the smell of manure. Romantic, isn't it? But despite the mud and the mess, these villages were where real life happened. Soldiers might have had their barracks, but civilians had the freedom to trade, gossip, and live lives that weren't defined entirely by military orders. And they had festivals. Imagine Saturnalia spilling out of the fort gates, with soldiers, traders, and families all celebrating together. Drunken singing. Lanterns in the muddy streets. Children running around with clay dolls while their parents exchanged cheap gifts. For one night, even the wall probably felt warm. One of the most charming finds from Vindolanda is a letter from a soldier's wife, Claudia Severa, inviting her friend to a birthday party. It's the earliest surviving handwriting from a woman in Latin that we know of. And what does it say? Essentially, come to my birthday, it'll be fun. Proof that even in the shadow of a stone frontier, people still worried about who was coming to their party. And think about it, those little parties, those dinners, those family squabbles, all happened under the same damp skies that soldiers cursed while on night duty. The wall wasn't just a line of stone. It was a living community, with all the laughter, gossip, and small dramas that any town has. Of course, not all civilian life was cheerful. Disease was common. Hygiene was, let's call it, variable. With so many people crammed into muddy huts, infections spread easily. Archaeologists have found skeletons showing signs of arthritis, malnutrition, and old injuries. Life was short, hard, and often painful. And yet, people stayed. Because where the army was, there was money, and protection, and a strange kind of stability. For all its damp misery, the wall offered a kind of security you didn't always get in the wild north. What's fascinating is how these worlds blurred. Children of soldiers often grew up bilingual, speaking Latin in the forts, Celtic with their mothers or local playmates. Over time, these communities became mixed. Roman and Briton, soldier and civilian, official and unofficial, all living side by side. It wasn't neat, it wasn't planned, but it was real. So when we imagine Hadrian's Wall, we shouldn't just see soldiers staring dramatically into the mist. We should also see children chasing chickens, women haggling over wool, traders shouting about the freshness of their oysters, and a tired soldier buying a pie after a long shift. And maybe, in the evenings, when the fort quieted down, and the torches flickered in the streets of the Vicus, the sounds of life would soften into something almost peaceful. Dogs barking, a baby crying, laughter drifting out of a tavern, and the ever-present sound of the wind sweeping across the moors. That was Hadrian's Wall, too. Not just stone and discipline, but families, communities, and the small joys that made life in the cold north bearable. And as we let those images settle, picture yourself walking slowly through one of those villages. The mud squelches under your sandals. A trader waves you over, trying to sell you roasted nuts. A child runs past, clutching a wooden toy sword. A woman leans out of a doorway, calling her husband in for dinner. And in the distance, the Great Wall looms, steady and silent. It's not glamorous. It's not epic. But it's life. And that's what makes it worth remembering. Now, if you plop thousands of soldiers from all corners of the empire in the middle of rainy northern Britain, you don't just get a mix of accents and food preferences. You also get a spiritual cocktail. And honestly, it was a pretty strange one. Hadrian's Wall wasn't just a military frontier. It was also a frontier of religion. Every fort, every vicus, every windswept hill nearby ended up with altars, shrines, and temples to just about every god you can imagine. Some were Roman, some were local, some were imported from halfway across the world. All of them ended up sharing the same soggy real estate. The official gods of Rome, of course, were everywhere. Jupiter, king of the gods, had shrines all along the wall. You couldn't throw a pebble without hitting an altar to him. Because if you're going to stand outside in the rain for 25 years, you might as well hedge your bets with the guy in charge. Mars, god of war, was another favorite. Soldiers carved his name into stone altars, asking for victory, protection, or maybe just less guard duty. The thing about Mars is that he wasn't just about battle, he was also tied to farming and fertility. So the same god who was supposed to help you stab enemies was also supposed to help your turnips grow. A very practical multitasker. And then there was Mithras. Oh, Mithras. If you've never heard of him, don't worry. Most people haven't. But in the Roman army, he was a big deal. Mithras was a mystery god from the east, probably Persian in origin, though heavily Romanized. His cult involved secret ceremonies in underground temples, where initiates would gather in dimly lit rooms, watch a ritual about Mithras killing a cosmic bull, and then share a communal meal. Think of it as a very exclusive dinner club, except everyone had to swear secrecy and wear weird hats. Mithria, those underground temples, have been found along Hadrian's Wall. Dark, narrow chambers, with stone benches along the sides, a central aisle, and an altar at the end. Soldiers would sit in the gloom, oil lamps flickering, smoke curling up from incense, and feel like they were part of something cosmic. For men stuck in endless rain, I guess the promise of mystical enlightenment sounded appealing. But Rome wasn't the only influence. The soldiers brought their own gods from home. A unit of Syrians stationed here built altars to local Syrian deities. Soldiers from Gaul honored their Celtic gods alongside Roman ones. Spaniards, Germans, North Africans, they all brought a piece of home with them. Imagine walking through a vicus and seeing altars lined up like an ancient spiritual buffet. Jupiter next to Mithras. A Celtic river goddess next to a Syrian sun god. Someone praying to Mars, someone else to a local forest spirit. Nobody seemed to mind the mix. As long as the prayers kept the rain away, or at least made guard duty less miserable, any god was welcome. And then there were the locals. The native Britons had their own pantheon of deities tied to rivers, hills, and forests. The Romans, ever practical, didn't stomp these out. Instead, they absorbed them. Oh, you worship this river goddess? Cool, we'll just call her a version of Minerva. Now she's Roman too. It was a win-win. The locals got to keep their gods, the Romans got to look tolerant, and everyone had more divine names to carve into stone altars. Archaeologists have found dozens of these inscriptions. Soldiers carving little thank you notes to gods. Things like, to Jupiter, best and greatest, for saving me from pneumonia. Or to Mars, for keeping the sheep-stealing locals at bay. Okay, maybe not in those exact words, but the sentiment was there. Superstition ran through daily life as well. Soldiers wore amulets for protection, little carvings of phalluses, for example. Yes, you heard that right. The Romans thought images of male genitals warded off evil. So you'd see them carved into walls, worn as pendants, even dangling from horse harnesses. Nothing says safe from curses like a tiny bronze phallus bouncing along with your cavalry unit. Other charms included carved stones, small figurines, or inscribed tablets. If you lost something, or suspected your neighbor stole it, you could write a curse tablet. These were little sheets of lead where you'd scratch a message asking the gods to smite whoever wronged you. Dozens of them have been found near the wall. Imagine being so angry about your missing socks that you ask Jupiter to strike your bunkmate with boils. The wall also attracted traveling cults. The cult of Isis, an Egyptian goddess, had followers here. Her temples involved music, incense, and processions. Probably a welcome splash of color in an otherwise grey landscape. There were also small shrines to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, because apparently even in Britain people longed for sunshine. Festivals punctuated the year. Saturnalia in December turned everything upside down. Masters served slaves, soldiers played pranks on officers, and everyone wore silly hats while drinking too much. Other festivals honored local gods, or celebrated seasonal changes. Even the most disciplined army couldn't resist a good excuse for a party. And then, of course, there were omens. Romans loved omens. Birds flying in strange patterns. Dreams that seemed significant. Odd noises in the night. Everything was potentially a message from the gods. Imagine you're on night watch. It's quiet, cold, and your cloak is soaked through. Suddenly an owl hoots. You decide it's a bad omen. You tell your squad the next morning. They all groan, because now everyone thinks something terrible is coming. Congratulations. The owl just ruined morale for the entire fort. But in all seriousness, religion mattered. It gave structure, meaning, and comfort to lives that were otherwise long stretches of boredom and damp. Soldiers prayed before shifts. Families left offerings at shrines. Traders swore oaths by their gods when making deals. In a world without central heating, antibiotics, or reliable postal service, you clung to whatever divine help you could get. And when we look at the ruins today, the broken altars, the weathered inscriptions, the fragments of temples, we can still hear the echoes of those prayers. A soldier whispering to Jupiter before stepping onto the wall. A mother leaving flowers at a shrine to protect her child. A group of men huddled in a dark mithraeum, chanting softly while oil lamps flickered on the stone. What's striking is how all of it blended. Rome didn't enforce a single religion here. They let people pile gods on top of gods until the wall became a spiritual patchwork quilt. Everyone was hedging their bets. If Jupiter didn't help, maybe the river spirit would. If Mars ignored you, maybe Mithras would step in. Someone had to be listening, right? And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Because whether you're a Syrian recruit praying to a sun god, or a local Briton leaving an offering to a river goddess, or a centurion sacrificing a sheep to Jupiter, at the end of the day, You just wanted to feel like you weren't facing the cold north alone. So tonight, as we sit by the wall in our imagination, picture the altars glowing with candlelight. Hear the quiet murmur of prayers drifting into the night. Smell the faint tang of incense mixing with the ever-present scent of rain. And imagine, for just a moment, that the gods really were listening. So, we've walked the barracks, eaten the barley stew, and sat through more religious ceremonies than anyone really asked for. Now it's time to watch the slow fade out. Because like most things in Roman history, Hadrian's wall didn't end with a bang. It ended with a slow, drawn-out sigh. When Hadrian first ordered the wall built in the 120s CE, it was Rome's bold statement, "This is the line, this is where we stop." And for a while, it worked. The forts were full, the villages thrived, and Rome's grip felt steady. But empires don't sit still forever. By the late 2nd century, things were already wobbling. The Emperor Antoninus Pius decided Hadrian's wall wasn't enough. So he built another wall, further north, the Antonine Wall, across Scotland. Because clearly, what northern Britain needed was twice the stone, twice the mud, and twice the drafty guard duty. It didn't last. The Antonine Wall was abandoned after a couple decades, and the soldiers marched back to Hadrian's wall like kids who tried moving into a bigger house and realized it was way too much upkeep. So the old wall went back to being the main frontier. The soldiers sighed, unpacked their socks, and got back to fixing the same ditches they'd already dug once before. The 3rd century brought new troubles. The Roman Empire itself was wobbling, emperors changing every few years, invasions on multiple fronts, plagues, economic crises. Hadrian's wall was far away from the center of all that, but the ripples were felt. Fewer supplies made it this far. Pay became irregular. Soldiers grumbled more than usual, which is saying something. And the locals noticed. Raids from the north grew more frequent. Small warbands slipping past the wall, stealing cattle, vanishing into the mist. The Romans could fight them off, but it was like trying to stop raindrops with a bucket. Exhausting, endless, and ultimately impossible. By the 4th century, the wall was still manned, but the cracks were showing. Archaeology shows some forts were repaired with sloppy work, walls patched with whatever stones were lying around, buildings rebuilt with less care. Imagine being stationed in a crumbling fort, rain dripping through the roof, and realizing the empire doesn't quite care about you anymore. Inspiring. Religion was changing too. Christianity was spreading, and with it, the old gods of Jupiter and Mithras began to fade. Shrines fell quiet. Temples were abandoned. Instead of sacrificing bulls, soldiers whispered prayers to Christ. A slow cultural shift, right here in the mud. And then, the big unraveling. In the early 5th century, Rome pulled its troops out of Britain altogether. The empire was collapsing under pressure from every direction. Visigoths in Italy, Vandals in Spain and North Africa, Huns thundering across Europe. Britain, way out on the edge, just wasn't a priority anymore. So the soldiers were recalled. The forts were emptied. Families packed what they could and drifted away. Traders shut their shops. The villages slowly emptied. And Hadrian's Wall, once a proud symbol of Rome's reach, was left to the wind and the rain. It didn't vanish overnight. Locals moved in, scavenging stone for their own houses. Farmers built sheep pens out of collapsed walls. Some forts lingered as little villages. But the wall as a Roman frontier, that was gone. Imagine walking along it in the 6th century. Moss creeping over the stones. Silent forts, roofs collapsed, altars toppled. Sheep grazing where soldiers once drilled. The echo of Rome fading into quiet pastureland. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if it all really happened at all. And that's the strange beauty of the wall. For centuries, it was the edge of the world, the place where empire met wilderness, where cultures collided, where thousands of lives were lived in mud and smoke. And then, it just wasn't. Time passed. The wall eroded. The empire crumbled. But little fragments remained. Stones carved with prayers. Letters scribbled on wooden tablets. Toys buried in the dirt. The ghosts of everyday life, clinging stubbornly to the ruins. Centuries later, medieval monks stumbled across the wall and scratched their heads. They didn't really know what it was. Some thought it was built by giants. Others decided it must have been the work of ancient kings. The idea that it was just Rome, bored and damp, never quite crossed their minds. By the 18th and 19th centuries, antiquarians started studying it properly. They sketched the forts, measured the walls, dug up altars. And of course, local farmers had already made good use of the stones, hauling them away to build barns and cottages. If you see an old farmhouse in northern England, chances are it has a little piece of Hadrian's wall in it. Recycling, Roman edition. And today, the wall still runs across the hills. Broken, mossy, but stubbornly present. You can walk it, mile after mile, following the same line soldiers once marched. The forts are ruins now, the villages long gone, but the echo of life is still there if you squint. The wind still howls. The sheep still stare. The rain still falls. Some things never change. There's something oddly comforting about its slow decline. Not a dramatic fall. Not a bloody last stand. Just a slow fade into the landscape, until empire became pasture, and history became memory. Because that's how most things end, not with trumpets or fireworks, but with silence. A wall turning into moss. A fort becoming rubble. A letter to a friend buried under the dirt, waiting 2,000 years to be read again. So tonight, as we sit with the ruins, picture them not as silent stones, but as the echoes of all the lives that passed through. Soldiers laughing over dice games. Children running with wooden toys. Traders shouting about overpriced oysters. Prayers whispered to gods, curses scratched onto lead, birthday invitations scrawled in ink. All of it drifting away, leaving only the wall behind. And as the mist settles over the hills, the wall seems less like a monument to empire, and more like a reminder that even the strongest walls crumble, but the small human stories, the socks, the stew, the birthday parties, are what last in memory. So here we are. We've walked the full length of Hadrian's Wall, from the noisy barracks to the muddy villages, through the smoky kitchens, into the dark Mithraic shrines, and finally down into the slow silence of ruin. Now it's time to let the echoes fade, and to rest with the wall itself. If you think about it, the wall was never really about walls. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way we usually imagine them. It wasn't an impenetrable shield, it wasn't the end of the world. It was more like Rome drawing a line in the mud and saying, "This is enough." And in that space, ordinary people lived. Soldiers complained about socks. Traders haggled over bread. Wives threw birthday parties. Kids played with wooden toys. Priests muttered prayers to a dozen different gods. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And maybe that's the best kind of history, the kind that isn't written in marble, but in grocery lists and dinner bowls. When we picture empires, we usually think about emperors in golden palaces, or legions marching in perfect formation. But most of Rome wasn't like that. Most of Rome was exactly this: people surviving another rainy day. People making jokes in the barracks. People finding small joys in bad beer and barley stew. And maybe that's why Hadrian's Wall feels so oddly comforting. Because it wasn't the center of the empire. It was the edge. The farthest outpost. The place where ambition finally gave way to practicality. And yet life here was as rich, as messy, and as human as anywhere else. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it again. The long line of stone, stretching across the hills. The forts huddled against the wind. Smoke rising from taverns in the Vici. Soldiers stomping along the ramparts, cloaks pulled tight. A child laughing as she chases a dog through the mud. A centurion muttering about oysters. A trader carefully counting his coins by lamplight. It's all there, in the quiet. And then, time passes. The soldiers leave. The forts crumble. The villagers scatter. The gods fall silent. The wall sinks into the earth. But even then, the small echoes remain. A toy shoe in the dirt. A scribbled invitation to a birthday. A stone altar with a half-erased inscription. Little voices whispering from the past, reminding us that history isn't just battles and emperors. It's socks, soup, and the long slow wait for dawn. If you've made it this far tonight, congratulations. You've traveled almost 2,000 years back, sat through 25 years of Roman service, and survived more than one bowl of barley stew. You've watched the wall rise, thrive, and fade into moss. And hopefully, somewhere along the way, you've also drifted gently into that quiet space between waking and sleep. Because the wall, for all its drama on paper, was really about waiting. About patience. About the long, slow rhythm of life repeating itself. And if there's one thing that makes good bedtime history, it's exactly that: repetition, routine, and the soft hum of human lives blending into the background. So let's leave the wall now. Let's let the wind sweep across the hills. Let the sheep graze in silence. Let the forts sink back into stone. And let the empire fade away into mist. Because the soldiers are gone. The traders are gone. The gods are gone. But the wall is still there. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. But elsewhere, something very different was unfolding. Not in a drafty Roman barracks, or a medieval tower full of moody kings, but somewhere warmer. Much warmer. Too warm, really. We're talking about the edge of the Sahara Desert, where the air hums with heat, sand stretches on forever, and in the middle of all that nothing, sits a city built on books. Yeah, books. Not gold, not spices, not flashy monuments. Just books. Timbuktu. The place your grade school geography teacher loved to use as shorthand for the middle of nowhere. But here's the twist. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was basically the Oxford of the desert. A city where dusty traders dragged in salt blocks on camelback, only to end up discussing theology with men who owned more manuscripts than most medieval European kings could dream of. Tonight, we're going to curl up in the sands of West Africa and wander through those quiet libraries. The stacks of parchment. The smell of ink and leather. The slow scratching of quills in the lamplight. It's not going to be dramatic, don't worry. Nobody's sword fighting in the streets. This is boring history at its finest. Endless caravans, endless manuscripts, and endless scholarly debates that probably kept people awake less than you're staying awake right now. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Picture yourself with a cup of mint tea, sitting cross-legged on a reed mat, while the desert wind rattles against a mud brick wall. Let's drift into Timbuktu. First, the city itself. Timbuktu sat near the Niger River, which is about as close as you get to beachfront property in the Sahara. It wasn't founded as some shining capital. It was basically a campsite. Tuareg nomads pitched their tents near the river in the 12th century, and the site stuck. Water, grazing land, and trade routes all met there, and slowly, mud brick houses replaced tents. By the 14th century, Timbuktu had turned into a proper city. And not just any city, this was the hub of the Mali Empire, which at the time was swimming in wealth. If you've heard of Mansa Musa, the guy who took a road trip to Mecca with so much gold he tanked Egypt's economy, yeah, that was Mali. And Timbuktu was one of its glittering jewels. Except Timbuktu's real treasure wasn't gold. It was paper. Now, paper doesn't sound glamorous, especially when you're imagining camel caravans trudging across dunes. But in a world where most people couldn't even sign their own name, a city filled with books was basically magic. Timbuktu had 3 major mosques, Sankor, Jingareba, and Sidi Yahya, that doubled as universities. Scholars gathered there, taught there, argued there. And when they weren't arguing, they were writing. They wrote everything. Legal opinions, commentaries on the Quran, works of astronomy, mathematics, poetry, histories of West African kingdoms, collections of proverbs. And then, because scholars can't resist, they copied and recopied until the city was drowning in manuscripts. By the 16th century, Timbuktu's libraries supposedly held hundreds of thousands of books. Whole families guarded their private collections like treasure. And they were treasure. Manuscripts were so valuable that people used them as currency. Imagine walking into a market and buying a goat with a book. That's Timbuktu. But let's not romanticize it too much. Daily life in Timbuktu wasn't all scholars and poetry. It was hot. Mud brick houses baked in the sun. The streets were dusty, narrow, and full of traders arguing over salt prices. Camels groaned under loads of gold dust, ivory, and slaves. And everywhere you went, the smell of ink, because if there was one thing Timbuktu produced more reliably than anything else, It was manuscripts. Think about that. A desert city, days away from the nearest forest, turned itself into one of the biggest book factories in the medieval world. Paper had to be imported, ink had to be made, scribes had to spend hours hunched over pages. And yet, they kept doing it. Because in Timbuktu, knowledge was prestige. Owning books wasn't just about learning. It was about showing the world that you were sophisticated, powerful, and connected. And of course, with books came egos. Scholars in Timbuktu had reputations that stretched across the Sahara. Some became famous for their commentaries, others for their teaching. Families passed down manuscripts like heirlooms. Rivalries flared up over legal interpretations. Honestly, it was probably the nerdiest city in Africa, and proud of it. But what's most striking is the quiet. Picture it, a room lined with wooden shelves, scrolls, and manuscripts stacked carefully. A scholar dips his reed pen into ink, scratches slowly across parchment. Outside, the call to prayer drifts through the streets. A camel bell jingles faintly in the distance. And that's it. No drama. No shouting. Just the endless hum of knowledge being written down in a place most of the world barely knew existed. And maybe that's the best way to start our journey tonight. Not with kings or wars, but with scholars quietly piling books higher and higher, until the sands themselves seemed to whisper with ink. Because Timbuktu wasn't really the middle of nowhere. It was the middle of everything. Alright, so if Timbuktu became famous for books, we need to answer a slightly boring but very important question. How did the books actually get there? Because Timbuktu isn't exactly next door to the printing presses of Venice, or the papyrus fields of Egypt. It's in the middle of a desert. And yet somehow, scribes in Timbuktu ended up copying Aristotle and Arabic astronomy manuals. The answer, of course, is camels. A lot of camels. And caravans that made UPS look like amateurs. Picture the Sahara. Not the tourist version with a few sand dunes and a nice sunset. The real Sahara. Endless, searing heat by day, bone-cracking cold at night, windstorms that can bury you alive, and a whole lot of nothing in between. This is not a landscape where you casually stroll with a backpack. You need the ships of the desert, the camels. Now, camels are weird. They're grumpy, smelly, and have a bad habit of spitting on people. But they are also the greatest desert transport ever invented. A camel can drink once, then walk for days. Its feet don't sink into the sand. It can carry up to 300 pounds on its back. And it doesn't care if the wind is pelting its face with sand, because frankly, camels always look annoyed anyway. So, the caravans were built on camel power. And these weren't small caravans. We're talking trains of hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels, trudging in single file across the dunes. Each camel loaded with salt, gold, slaves, ivory, or, if you were lucky, books. Salt was the big one. The Sahara had giant salt mines, especially in places like Tagaza. Enormous slabs of salt were cut out of the ground, loaded onto camels, and dragged south. In a world without refrigerators, salt was literally life. You needed it to preserve food, flavor stew, and keep cattle alive. And it was worth its weight in gold. Sometimes literally. So caravans carried salt down to Timbuktu, and from Timbuktu, books and gold dust traveled back north. The city became a marketplace where the desert routes met the river routes. Traders brought manuscripts from Cairo, Fez, or even further afield. Scholars bought them, copied them, and added their own commentaries. Then the copies circulated again. Knowledge flowing across the desert, one grumpy camel at a time. Now, imagine being a traveler in one of these caravans. You'd wake up before dawn, pack your camel, and start walking. Day after day. Sand, rocks, horizon, repeat. The wind howling in your ears, sand stinging your eyes. At night, you'd huddle around a small fire, sip a little water, maybe chew some dates, and try not to freeze. And this could go on for months. A journey from Morocco to Timbuktu could take 3 or 4 months each way. That's half a year of your life just to deliver some books. Amazon Prime, this was not. But the caravans weren't just camels and merchants. They were little moving cities. You had guides who knew the desert paths. Guards to fend off bandits. cooks to make bland meals out of dried grain and goat meat. And inevitably, you had scholars tagging along, hoping to bring their precious manuscripts to a new market. So imagine this dusty procession, stretching across the desert. Hundreds of camels, traders shouting, guards yawning, scholars clutching satchels of parchment, worrying that sandstorms might ruin their ink. It must have looked absurd. And yet, it worked. Timbuktu thrived because of this system. The caravans connected it to Cairo, Tunis, and Fez. Goods flowed south, manuscripts flowed in, ideas flowed both ways. The Sahara wasn't an empty void, it was a highway. A very inconvenient, exhausting highway, but a highway nonetheless. And along that highway, books traveled. Religious texts, scientific treatises, philosophical works. They were copied in North Africa, carried across the desert, unpacked in Timbuktu, and then recopied again. Slowly, knowledge spread, by camel. But of course, the caravans weren't all romance and learning. They also carried slaves. Thousands of them. Captives taken in raids or wars, marched across the desert in chains. For every crate of books that arrived in Timbuktu, there were also lines of human beings treated as cargo. That's part of the story too. The city's wealth wasn't just built on parchment and ink. It was built on people. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Timbuktu's golden age of learning was funded by trade that wasn't always noble. Salt, gold, slaves, manuscripts, all tangled together. Because even the greatest libraries of history usually have something a little grim hiding in their basement. Still, the sheer stubbornness of it all is impressive. The idea that people thought, yes, let's drag paper across a desert full of scorpions, snakes, and sandstorms. And not just once. Over and over again, for centuries. All because someone in Timbuktu wanted to own the latest commentary on Islamic law or a new copy of Aristotle. Imagine the scene. A caravan finally stumbles into Timbuktu after 3 months. The camels are cranky, the traders half dead from exhaustion. But then a scholar comes rushing up, eyes lighting up at the sight of a crate of manuscripts. He haggles, bargains, probably overpays, and then runs off to his house clutching his prize like it's Christmas morning. That was Timbuktu's real magic, the hunger for books, even in the middle of the desert. And so, page by page, camel by camel, the libraries grew. Manuscripts stacked in wooden chests. Shelves groaning under the weight of parchment. Families hoarding their collections, building private archives that became more valuable than gold. A city built on knowledge, sustained by the most unglamorous transport system imaginable. Now, as we let that image settle, picture the desert at night. A caravan resting. Camels groaning softly, the smell of smoke and roasting grain drifting on the air. Traders sprawled under blankets, staring at the stars. And maybe, just maybe, one scholar sitting cross-legged, unwrapping a manuscript by lamplight, reading a page by the flicker of the fire. Because in the middle of all that nothing, words still mattered. So, the caravans have arrived. The camels have dumped their loads of salt, ivory, and, if we're lucky, a few crates of manuscripts. The traders shuffle off to haggle in the markets. The soldiers count coins. And now, in the quieter corners of Timbuktu, the real magic begins. The scribes go to work. Because a manuscript is only valuable if you can copy it. And copy it again. And then copy it some more, until there are enough floating around to keep scholars happy, students supplied, and families proud of their personal libraries. Life as a scribe was not glamorous. Forget images of scholarly grandeur. This was hours and hours of back-breaking, eye-straining labor. A man hunched over a low wooden desk, scratching away with a reed pen, trying to keep his handwriting neat while the desert flies buzzed around his ears. The tools were simple. Paper or parchment, imported from far away, since the Sahara wasn't exactly a paper mill. Ink made from soot, gum, and water, sometimes mixed with a little plant dye to make it darker. A pen cut from a reed, sharpened to a fine nib. And a whole lot of patience. One mistake, one sloppy stroke, and you either scraped the ink off, if you were lucky, or you had to start over. Imagine spending 3 hours copying a page of dense Arabic commentary, only to sneeze and smudge it all. Congratulations, you're back to square one. But it wasn't just about copying. Scribes also decorated. Margins filled with geometric designs, calligraphy that curled like vines, headings in red or gold. Timbuktu manuscripts weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Even in the middle of the desert, style mattered. Because nothing says, "I'm a sophisticated scholar," like owning a book that doubles as interior decoration. And, of course, every scribe had his quirks. Some wrote tiny and cramped, trying to save paper. Others sprawled their letters out like they were being paid by the inch. Some carefully copied every diacritical mark, others, not so much. Scholars centuries later would tear their hair out trying to figure out what a sleepy scribe had meant on a long afternoon in 1450. Meanwhile, the scholars themselves floated above all this in a haze of learning and ego. Timbuktu scholars were celebrities in their own world. Families competed to claim the best teachers. Students gathered in shaded courtyards to hear lectures. And if you were a really prestigious scholar, you didn't even bother copying your own manuscripts. You had students and scribes for that. Because what's the point of intellectual authority if you can't outsource the boring bits? Lectures weren't what you're imagining, though. This wasn't a lecture hall with chalkboards. Students sat on mats, copying notes onto little tablets. The teacher read from a manuscript, explained the meaning, and added his own commentary. Sometimes he'd dictate entire treatises, word for word, while students scrambled to keep up. Basically the medieval version of "this will be on the exam." And what did they study? Oh, everything. Theology, of course. Islamic law. Commentaries on the Quran. But also astronomy, how to calculate the movements of the stars, which mattered for navigation and for religious calendars. Medicine, using herbs, diets, and the occasional wildly optimistic cure. Mathematics. Logic. Poetry. History. You name it. Somebody in Timbuktu was copying it into a manuscript. One scholar in particular, Ahmed Baba, 1556 to 1627, became famous as Timbuktu's intellectual giant. He supposedly owned a personal library of 1,600 books, which, to put that in perspective, was bigger than most university libraries in Europe at the time. He wrote works on law, history, and biography, and he was so influential that when the Moroccans invaded Timbuktu in 1591, they hauled him back to Marrakesh like a prize intellectual trophy. Imagine being so bookish that someone conquers a city just to kidnap you for their dinner parties. But Ahmed Baba wasn't alone. Timbuktu had whole dynasties of scholars, the Akits, the Sankors, the Kaiti family, who guarded their libraries like dragons hoarding gold. Manuscripts were passed down from father to son, with marginal notes and commentaries building up like sediment over generations. Open one, and you might find 5 different scholars arguing with each other in the margins, separated by 100 years. Basically the world's most passive-aggressive group chat, but on parchment. Now, let's slow down and imagine a day in the life of a Timbuktu scribe. You wake before dawn, to the sound of the call to prayer drifting across the mud-brick rooftops. The desert is cool for once, the stars just fading. You shuffle to the mosque, murmur your prayers, and then settle into your workspace. A mat on the floor, a low desk, your tools spread out neatly. The light grows stronger. The flies appear. You dip your reed pen, pull a fresh sheet of paper from a chest, and begin. Wort by wort. Line by line. Hours pass. Your back aches. Your eyes blur. You pause, stretch, sip some water, and then keep going. Outside, the street fills with noise, traders shouting, camels groaning, but you're still bent over the page, coaxing words into the world. By afternoon, your hand is cramped. You've managed maybe 2 or 3 pages, if you're lucky. Someone knocks at the door, delivering another order. A merchant wants a copy of a legal text. A scholar wants a duplicate of an astronomy treatise. You sigh, set aside today's work, and sharpen your reed pen again. Tomorrow, the same. The day after, the same. And on, until the chest beside you is full of manuscripts that will outlive you. It's not glamorous, but it is strangely peaceful. The rhythm of the pen, the quiet scratch of ink, the way a blank page slowly fills with lines. Boring? Absolutely. But boring can also be beautiful. And through that boredom, Timbuktu became legendary. Not because its scholars fought wars or built palaces, but because they kept writing, copying, arguing in the margins, filling chest after chest with manuscripts until the desert itself seemed to rustle with paper. Now, let's let that image sink in. A room dimly lit by oil lamps, wooden shelves sagging with manuscripts, a scribe bent over a desk, scratching slowly with his reed pen. Outside, the evening call to prayer echoes. The desert cools. The stars appear again. And inside, the ink dries on another page, one more thread in the endless web of words that turned Timbuktu into a city of books. By now, we've seen the caravans trudging through the desert, the scribes hunched over their desks, and the manuscripts stacking up in dusty rooms. But here's the thing, those manuscripts didn't just vanish into thin air. Somebody had to own them. And in Timbuktu, owning books wasn't just about knowledge. It was about status. About showing the world that your family wasn't just rich, but cultured. So, entire families turned into dynasties of scholars. Imagine your grandfather, your father, your cousins, your uncles, all competing to see who could own the most books, write the most commentaries, or attract the best students. Forget family feuds over farmland. In Timbuktu, the real drama was, who has the better library? One of the most famous was the Akit family. They were basically Timbuktu's intellectual aristocracy. 4 generations, the Akits served as judges, teachers, and scholars. Their name carried weight in every legal debate, every scholarly gathering. If an Akit gave an opinion on Islamic law, you listened, even if you secretly thought he was being a little extra. The Akits collected manuscripts like modern influencers collect sponsorships. Religious law, poetry, history, you name it, they had a copy. And not just a copy, but a copy with their own neat little commentary scribbled in the margins. Because in Timbuktu, the margins were where the real action happened. A book wasn't just a text, it was a family heirloom, layered with decades of notes, arguments, and polite disagreements. Then there were the Katie family, who traced their ancestry back to Andalusia in Spain. According to their own tradition, their forefather was a Muslim refugee who fled Spain after the Reconquista, bringing books with him across the desert. And because nothing makes a better family origin story than exile plus books, the Katies leaned into it hard. The Katie family library became one of Timbuktu's crown jewels. It held works not just from North Africa and the Middle East, but from Spain itself, preserving traces of a lost intellectual world. Think about that. While Spain was busy kicking out its Muslim and Jewish populations, Timbuktu was quietly absorbing their manuscripts, tucking them away in wooden chests, and treating them like treasures. And of course, we can't forget the Sankor line, tied to the Sankor Mosque University. These scholars were less about hoarding manuscripts and more about teaching. Generations of Sankor scholars trained students who went on to become judges, scribes, and authors in their own right. Their reputation wasn't just built on how many books they owned, but on how many minds they shaped. Which, in a city like Timbuktu, was basically the same thing. Owning a library in Timbuktu was like owning a sports car in the modern world. It screamed prestige. Except instead of roaring engines, you had stacks of parchment. Families competed quietly, but fiercely. Who had the oldest manuscripts? Who had the best copies? Who had the widest range of commentaries? Forget gossip about someone's clothing. People in Timbuktu were whispering, "Did you hear how many manuscripts the Akits have? It's ridiculous." And unlike sports cars, these libraries could actually pay off. Manuscripts were used as currency. Families could lend them, sell them, or use them to gain influence. A well-stocked library meant people came to you for answers, for judgments, for wisdom. And in a culture where reputation was everything, that mattered. But let's slow down and picture a family library. Not a massive building with marble halls, more like a mud brick house, modest on the outside, but inside, a series of rooms lined with wooden shelves. Chests stacked neatly in corners. Manuscripts wrapped in leather or cloth to keep out dust. The air thick with the smell of parchment and ink. Children growing up in these households would have played hide and seek around piles of books. They'd have learned to read by tracing letters on old manuscripts. And by the time they were teenagers, they were expected to join the family tradition, either writing, copying, or at least pretending to study while sneaking out to the market. Imagine being 12 years old and realizing your father expects you to continue the family library. No pressure, son, but if you could just memorize the Quran, master Islamic law, and maybe write a 10-volume commentary on astronomy by next week, that'd be great. And these weren't just solitary pursuits. Families invited students into their homes. A library wasn't a private collection, it was a classroom. Picture half a dozen students sitting cross-legged in a courtyard, while an elderly scholar reads aloud from a manuscript, pausing to explain, adding his own thoughts, occasionally snapping at someone who clearly didn't do the reading. Education. Desert style. Sometimes, the entire family pitched in. The father taught, the older sons wrote commentaries, the younger ones copied, the women of the household preserved the manuscripts and managed the collections. Libraries were living things, passed down, expanded, argued over. But libraries are fragile, and Timbuktu knew this all too well. Fire, termites, moisture, raiders, all of them threatened manuscripts. Families had to guard their collections carefully. Some manuscripts were hidden in clay pots. Others were wrapped in cloth and tucked into walls. Knowledge was treasure, but it was treasure that could vanish if you weren't careful. That's part of why families treated their libraries like heirlooms. Losing a manuscript wasn't just losing a book. It was losing part of your identity, your history, your family's prestige. Which is why, centuries later, when Timbuktu faced invasion and colonialism, people risked their lives to hide their libraries in the desert. But that's a story for another night. What makes it soothing, in a sleepy sort of way, is the sheer normalcy of it all. Imagine an evening in Timbuktu, around 1500. The sun is setting, painting the mud walls golden. Inside one of these homes, a scholar sits surrounded by his family. He's reading a manuscript aloud, his son scribbling notes, his wife carefully rewrapping a stack of parchment in cloth. Outside, traders pack up their stalls, children chase each other in the dust, a camel groans in the distance. It's not dramatic. It's not flashy, but it's a city alive with words, every family library humming quietly in the background. And that's the strange thing about Timbuktu. It became legendary not for kings or battles, but for households, ordinary people, in their mud brick homes, stubbornly piling up books in a desert where paper had no business surviving. So the next time someone says Timbuktu like it's the middle of nowhere, remember this: for centuries, it was actually the middle of knowledge. A city where families competed not in castles or battlefields, but in libraries. Where status was measured not in gold, but in how many manuscripts you could cram into a wooden chest. So far, we've been circling around the manuscripts like nosy neighbors, admiring the shelves, watching the scribes, nodding politely at the families who guarded them. But what were these books actually about? After all, you don't risk dragging paper across the Sahara just for blank notebooks. Well, unless you're a medieval bullet journal enthusiast. No, these manuscripts were crammed with ideas. And here's the best part: they weren't just religious texts. Sure, the Quran and Islamic law took up plenty of space. But Timbuktu's manuscripts ranged from the deeply serious, legal codes that could put you to sleep faster than chamomile tea, to the quietly whimsical, collections of poetry, riddles, and even the occasional medical recipe that sounds suspiciously like snake oil. Let's start with the heavyweight, law. Islamic jurisprudence was the backbone of Timbuktu's scholarship. Judges needed texts to settle disputes. Students needed them to pass exams. Scholars needed them so they could argue endlessly about minor details. Whole shelves were dedicated to works on Maliki law, one of the major schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Picture a scholar hunched over a manuscript, carefully explaining to his students the proper regulations for inheritance, or the finer points of commercial contracts, or the legal nuances of marriage and divorce. Riveting stuff. And yet, essential for running a society. Timbuktu was a trade city, which meant contracts, debts, and lawsuits everywhere. Someone had to keep the paperwork straight, and those someones were Timbuktu's jurists. And if you think today's legal language is hard to follow, just imagine centuries of scholars layering commentary on top of commentary. 1 page of text, 3 pages of notes in the margins, and then a few extra clarifications squeezed in between the lines. Reading one of these manuscripts must have felt like listening to a room full of lawyers argue with themselves across time. But law wasn't the only game in town. Astronomy was another big one. And honestly, astronomy makes perfect sense for a desert city. When you're surrounded by an ocean of sand, the stars are your road signs. Caravans needed astronomy to navigate. Religious scholars needed it to calculate prayer times and the dates of Ramadan. And everyone needed it just to keep track of seasons. So manuscripts on astronomy filled the shelves, charts of star movements, tables for lunar cycles, treatises on eclipses. Some works borrowed from Greek astronomy, translated through Arabic. Others were original compositions, written by Timbuktu's own scholars. Picture a manuscript covered in neat diagrams of constellations, with notes about which stars rise when, and how to use them to find your way across the desert. Now imagine being the student told to memorize all of this, when you'd rather be outside actually looking at the stars. Poor guy. And then there was medicine, which, let's be honest, was a mixed bag. Some medical manuscripts were surprisingly practical, lists of herbs and their uses, guidance on diet, advice on setting broken bones. Others, less so. You'd find recipes that involved chanting verses, mixing animal parts into potions, or applying what can only be described as wishful thinking to an illness. Still, these texts mattered. They blended local African knowledge with Islamic and Mediterranean traditions, creating a hybrid medical culture. If you had a toothache in Timbuktu, you might get an herbal poultice, a recitation of prayers, and a stern lecture on your diet. A 3-in-1 treatment plan, basically. Now, let's not forget poetry. Because what's the point of all that law and medicine if you can't write a few verses about your feelings? Timbuktu's manuscripts are filled with poetry, some religious, some romantic, some just plain silly. Students memorized verses. Scholars quoted them in lectures. Families copied them into collections. One poem might praise God's greatness. Another might describe the beauty of a desert landscape. Another might be a love poem, written in flowery metaphors about moons and gardens. And tucked in between, the occasional satirical jab, because no scholarly culture is complete without someone writing sarcastic poetry about their rival's bad handwriting. History and biography also filled the shelves. Chronicles of local rulers, lists of scholars, genealogies of great families. These texts gave Timbuktu its memory, who ruled when, which scholar taught whom, how families traced their prestige back through generations. One famous work, the Tariq al-Sudan, written in the 17th century by al-Sadi, is basically Timbuktu's official history book. It chronicles rulers, wars, dynasties, and scholars, with the kind of dry detail that puts most bedtime stories to shame. But it's also invaluable. Without it, we'd know far less about Timbuktu's golden age. And then there were the miscellaneous oddities. Because no library is complete without them. Manuscripts on math, multiplication tables, geometry, fractions. Manuscripts on grammar, because scholars loved correcting each other's Arabic. Collections of proverbs, the medieval version of quote-of-the-day calendars. And even magic, yes, magic. Amulets, incantations, protective spells written neatly on parchment, sometimes to be carried in little leather pouches. Because even scholars liked a good insurance policy against evil spirits. The sheer range is what's astonishing. A student in Timbuktu might spend the morning memorizing Maliki law, the afternoon calculating lunar cycles, and the evening copying love poetry for his personal notebook. All in a city that most Europeans at the time couldn't even find on a map. And it's worth pausing on that. In 15th century Europe, many kings were barely literate. Whole villages might not own a single book. Meanwhile, in Timbuktu, families were building private libraries of hundreds or thousands of manuscripts. All in mud brick houses on the edge of the Sahara. Of course, all of this came with endless debates. Scholars in Timbuktu didn't just copy manuscripts, they argued with them. A law book might have margins filled with commentary. This ruling is correct, but only if, or so-and-so completely misunderstood this verse. A medical treatise might have additions. In our climate, use this herb instead. Knowledge wasn't static. It was alive, scribbled into the margins, layered over generations. So if you ever think footnotes are boring, remember that Timbuktu's entire intellectual tradition was basically a 1,000-year-long footnote argument written on parchment. Now, Let's step into one of those rooms for a moment. A small study, lit by oil lamps. A scholar sits with his students, reading aloud from a manuscript of astronomy. The students nod, scribble notes, sometimes doze. On the shelf nearby, a pile of poetry waits to be recited. In the next room, legal texts sit stacked in a chest, while someone quietly copies out a medical recipe for an aching stomach. Outside, the desert night hums with crickets. It's not exciting. It's not dramatic. But it's alive. A city breathing through books. So when people today hear Timbuktu and think middle of nowhere, it's worth remembering, this nowhere once held thousands of voices, arguing across the pages of manuscripts, writing about everything from the stars to stomach aches to moonlit romance. A desert city, built out of words. So far, Timbuktu has been shimmering in the desert sun, camels trudging in with books, families hoarding manuscripts, scholars scribbling endlessly in the margins. But golden ages never last forever. Eventually, the ink dries, the shelves gather dust, and the city that once seemed like the beating heart of the Sahara starts to fade into the background noise of history. And that's exactly what happened to Timbuktu. Not in one dramatic collapse, no explosions, no walls crumbling in a single night, but in the slow, steady way that most great centers of knowledge fade. Bit by bit, sand grain by sand grain. The first cracks appeared in the late 16th century. In 1591, the Moroccans decided that Timbuktu's wealth looked just a little too tempting. So they invaded. Which, on one hand, was impressive. Marching an army across the Sahara is basically the world's worst road trip. On the other hand, it didn't do much good for Timbuktu. The city was conquered. Scholars were dragged off to Morocco. Libraries were seized. Ahmed Barber, remember him, the superstar scholar with 1,600 books? He was hauled to Marrakesh like an intellectual trophy. And, just to rub salt in the wound, the Moroccans confiscated his entire library. Which means even one of Timbuktu's brightest minds spent part of his career muttering in exile about how he wanted his books back. But conquest wasn't the end. Timbuktu kept going. The manuscripts stayed. Families clung to them. Students still gathered in the mosques. But the city's political importance dwindled. Trade routes shifted. Caravans came less often. Wealth trickled away. And slowly, Timbuktu went from being a bustling hub of scholarship to a quieter, dustier outpost. By the 18th century, European explorers were hearing whispers of this legendary city filled with books. To them, it sounded like El Dorado, except instead of gold, it was manuscripts. Which, let's be honest, is far less cinematic. Try pitching Indiana Jones and the Library of Timbuktu and see how fast Hollywood turns you down. Then came the 19th century, and with it, colonialism. French forces arrived, looking to plant their flag. And as usual, European colonizers weren't exactly gentle custodians of local culture. Timbuktu's libraries were neglected, plundered, or dismissed as irrelevant. After all, to the colonial mindset, real knowledge came from Europe, not from mud brick houses in the Sahara. Manuscripts were sold off. Others were abandoned. Families who had safeguarded their collections for centuries now had to hide them from colonial officials, who either didn't care or actively tried to remove them. It was survival mode for the libraries. And yet, they endured. Quietly, stubbornly, the people of Timbuktu kept their manuscripts safe. Families buried them in the sand. Others tucked them into secret rooms or clay jars. Some wrapped them in cloth and sealed them away in attics. Knowledge went underground, literally. Imagine that for a moment. A family, knowing their city was crumbling, wrapping up their manuscripts, books on law, astronomy, poetry, medicine, and hiding them in the earth. Not for themselves, maybe not even for their children, but for the simple hope that someday, someone would read them again. That's how much these books mattered. By the 20th century, Timbuktu's reputation in the wider world was half myth, half punchline. In Europe and America, Timbuktu became shorthand for the middle of nowhere. A dusty dot on a map, vaguely exotic, vaguely forgotten. But beneath the sand, the manuscripts were still there. Quiet, patient, waiting. And then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they began to re-emerge. Scholars, archivists, and local families worked together to preserve them. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts resurfaced, some beautifully preserved, others fragile and crumbling. They were cleaned, catalogued, digitized. And suddenly, the world remembered, Timbuktu wasn't nowhere. It had been everywhere, all along. Of course, the manuscripts faced new threats. In 2012, armed militants swept into Timbuktu during a wave of conflict in Mali. Suddenly, the libraries were at risk again. But in a story that sounds almost too good to be true, locals stepped up. Families, librarians, and volunteers smuggled hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out of Timbuktu, hiding them in metal trunks and boats, sneaking them down the Niger River under the noses of militants. It was a rescue mission worthy of legend, but done quietly, with no explosions, no gunfights. Just boxes of books being carried, one by one, into safety. The kind of heroism that involves sore backs and paper cuts, not swords. And maybe that's the most fitting kind of heroism for Timbuktu. What's remarkable is the continuity. For centuries, Timbuktu's manuscripts survived conquest, neglect, colonialism, even modern conflict. Not because they were locked in marble halls or guarded by armies, but because ordinary people cared. Families held on to them. Scholars copied them. Communities risked everything to protect them. Think about that. Empires rose and fell, flags changed, trade routes shifted, but the manuscripts endured. Quietly, patiently. Because for Timbuktu, books weren't just books. They were memory, identity, prestige, a family's honor and a city's soul, all bound up in parchment. And that's what makes the decline of Timbuktu so oddly soothing, in a sleepy history kind of way. It wasn't a dramatic fireball. It wasn't a single tragic day. It was a slow settling, like sand drifting over stone. The city faded, but the books stayed. Dusty, crumbling, hidden in trunks and walls, but still alive. So tonight, as we drift into the quiet, imagine those manuscripts slumbering beneath the sands. Wrapped in cloth, tucked into clay jars, stacked in secret rooms. Waiting centuries for someone to find them again. Silent, but never gone. So, Timbuktu had faded. The caravans were fewer, the great scholars were gone, and the manuscripts were sleeping quietly in clay jars and dusty trunks. For centuries, the outside world thought Timbuktu was either myth or, at best, a backwater. And yet, the books were still there. Silent, patient, waiting. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the wider world started to realize what had survived. And, in typical fashion, people were shocked. Wait, scholars said, there are hundreds of thousands of manuscripts sitting in the Sahara? Just, in people's houses. Yes, that's exactly where they were. The rediscovery began slowly. Local families, who had been quietly preserving their collections for centuries, started working with researchers and archivists. In the 1970s and 80s, academics from Mali and abroad began cataloging what they found. Libraries like the Ahmed Barber Institute were established to house and protect manuscripts. What had once been hidden in trunks was now being carefully cataloged and digitized. And the sheer scale was staggering. Not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. Manuscripts on every subject we've already wandered through: law, astronomy, medicine, poetry, history, spanning centuries. Some beautifully preserved, with crisp calligraphy and bright colors. Others fragile, their ink faded, their pages brittle from centuries of desert air. For scholars, it was like opening a time capsule. Here was an intellectual tradition that had been largely ignored by mainstream narratives of history. For too long, Africa had been painted as a place without books, without written knowledge. And yet, Timbuktu's manuscripts proved otherwise, loudly, or at least as loudly as brittle parchment can shout. Of course, rediscovery brought new problems. Old paper doesn't handle modern humidity very well, or modern neglect. So preservation became a priority. Air-conditioned archives were built. Digital projects were launched. People began scanning manuscripts page by page, turning them into pixels before they crumbled to dust. And this work wasn't just done by international organizations. Local Malians led the way. Librarians, archivists, and families who had preserved the manuscripts for centuries became their guardians in a new era. Because who better to care for them than the people who had already kept them alive through invasions, neglect, and colonialism? Then came 2012. Northern Mali fell into conflict, and Timbuktu was suddenly occupied by militants. The manuscripts were in danger again. And once again, the people of Timbuktu stepped up. Abdelkader Haidara, a local librarian, organized a rescue operation. Families, traders, and volunteers smuggled manuscripts out of Timbuktu, hundreds of thousands of them. They packed them in metal trunks, loaded them onto carts and boats, and slipped them down the Niger River. Quietly, patiently, without fanfare. It was one of the greatest library rescues in history, not with explosions or daring sword fights, but with people carrying boxes of paper through the night. Heroism by way of cardboard and sore shoulders. And that, somehow, feels exactly right for Timbuktu. Today, those manuscripts are scattered across libraries in Mali, some in Bamako, others still hidden in family homes. Many are digitized. Some are still being carefully catalogued. And slowly, the world is beginning to appreciate them not as relics, but as part of a living tradition. Because that's the point. The manuscripts aren't just dusty old paper. They are memory. They tell us that Africa wasn't silent. It wasn't without books. It had cities like Timbuktu, where people argued about law, charted the stars, wrote poetry, and hoarded manuscripts like treasure. And maybe the most comforting thing is how ordinary it all is. These weren't superhuman geniuses writing in ivory towers. They were scribes hunched over desks, students dozing through lectures, families tucking manuscripts into trunks. Ordinary people, doing ordinary things, copying, reading, teaching, until their city became legendary. Which, if you think about it, is the best bedtime story of all. Not battles, not kings, but people sitting in small, dimly lit rooms, writing words they hoped someone might read someday. So tonight, as we close the book on Timbuktu, imagine yourself in one of those houses. Mud brick walls glowing in the firelight. Wooden chests stacked in the corner. A scholar carefully turning the pages of a fragile manuscript. Children listening drowsily as their grandfather reads poetry. Outside, the desert wind hums against the door. Inside, the ink whispers on the page. Meanwhile, in another corner of history, we're not marching across Rome's damp frontier, and we're not trudging through Timbuktu's sand dunes, we're floating. And not just anywhere. This time, we're in Venice. A city that somehow thought, you know what would be a great place to build a metropolis? A swamp. And then actually did it. Venice is one of those cities that doesn't quite make sense on paper. A cluster of tiny islands, stuck in a lagoon, endlessly damp, and constantly smelling faintly of fish. And yet, somehow, it became one of the richest, strangest, most beautiful cities in the world. A city of canals instead of streets. Of gondolas instead of horses. Of bells, shadows, and whispers drifting across the water. And, perfect for us tonight, Venice is also a city that's at its best when you slow down. This isn't a city built for sprinting. It's built for drifting. The pace of oars dipping into water, the rhythm of footsteps echoing on bridges, the steady toll of bells from 100 churches. Which, conveniently, is also the perfect pace for falling asleep. So, let's imagine we're here. It's late evening in the lagoon. The canals are quiet, the water glimmers faintly in the lamplight, and somewhere in the distance, a gondolier hums a song that is probably sung 10,000 times. The city is old already, crowded with stories, but tonight we're not looking for drama. We're just going to drift along the water, through daily life, odd habits, and quiet shadows. Venice wasn't founded with some grand plan. It started as an escape hatch. When the Roman Empire was falling apart, people fled the mainland for the safety of the islands. Out here, in the swampy lagoon, you were harder to raid, less appealing to invade. Raiders liked gold, not mud. And so, the little islands filled with refugees, farmers, fishermen, traders, who slowly decided that if they were going to be stuck in a marsh, they might as well build something permanent. The early Venetians drove wooden piles into the mud, creating foundations for houses. They built bridges, canals, little churches. And somehow, this mess of wood and mud didn't sink. Instead, it grew. Over centuries, Venice transformed from a refugee camp into a city that seemed to float on the water like a mirage. Of course, the reality was less glamorous. Imagine the smell. The early canals weren't exactly sparkling clean. More like open sores with ambition. Add fish guts, market stalls, and the occasional dead pig floating past, and you've got the perfume of early Venice. Eau de swamp. But the thing about Venice is that it leaned into the weirdness. Instead of fighting the water, it embraced it. Streets became canals. Horses became gondolas. And gradually, what had started as a desperate improvisation turned into a unique way of life. By the Middle Ages, Venice was bustling. Ships came and went, loaded with grain, wine, spices, silk. Merchants grew rich. Palaces sprang up along the Grand Canal, their windows reflecting on the water like glittering, slightly damp mirrors. But despite the wealth, the city always kept its watery strangeness. There were no rumbling carts or galloping horses here. Just boats sliding silently through the canals, oars creaking, voices carrying strangely across the water. Venice was a city of echoes, half-heard conversations drifting out of open windows, laughter bouncing across the lagoon, church bells tolling at odd hours. And that's the Venice we're settling into tonight. Not the tourist postcard version, but the lived-in, slightly grimy, endlessly fascinating city that murmured on its canals. A city where gossip floated as easily as gondolas, where shadows clung to narrow alleys, and where the water was always waiting beneath your feet. So, picture yourself waking up in Venice. The first thing you hear isn't roosters or carts rattling on cobblestones. It's water. Always water. The soft slap of it against the walls of your house. The faint creak of boats tied to posts. Maybe the distant splash of someone already rowing out to start their day. Life in Venice began with the tide. The lagoon dictated the rhythm of everything. When the tide was high, boats moved easily. When it was low, you might find yourself staring at sticky mudflats. And in the middle of summer, the smell, let's just say Venice was an acquired taste. Now, let's float down to the canals. Gondolas weren't just tourist traps back then, they were the Uber of medieval Venice. Sleek, black boats rowed by gondoliers with impressive balance and, usually, even more impressive opinions. A gondolier wasn't just a boatman. He was your driver, your guide, and often your source of unsolicited political commentary. Imagine climbing into a gondola, settling onto the wooden bench, and immediately hearing the gondolier mutter about how the price of pepper is ridiculous this year. And also, by the way, your neighbor's daughter is definitely sneaking around with the baker's apprentice. Venetian gondoliers were basically rowing tabloids. They also had the best gossip because they overheard everything. Gondolas slid under windows, lingered at docks, carried rich merchants to secret meetings. Voices carry over water, which meant gondoliers were unwilling witnesses to half the city's private affairs. If you wanted to know who was cheating on whom, who was skimming profits, or who was bribing which official, you asked a gondolier. They knew. They always knew. Merchants, of course, were everywhere. Venice was built on trade, which meant every canal seemed to smell faintly of spices, salt, or fish. The Rialto market buzzed with noise, men shouting about the freshness of their eels, others weighing sacks of grain, still others arguing over whether that cloth really came from Damascus or was just a cheap knockoff from somewhere closer. Venetian merchants had a reputation for being both brilliant and insufferable. Brilliant, because they turned a swamp into one of the richest economies in Europe. Insufferable, because they never stopped talking about profit margins. Imagine being trapped on a gondola next to a merchant who spends the entire ride explaining how clever he was to shave 2 coins off a shipment of cinnamon. By the end, you'd probably want to throw yourself into the canal. But trade wasn't just about goods. It was about people. Venetians rubbed shoulders with sailors from Greece, traders from the Ottoman Empire, spice dealers from India, diplomats from France. The city was a stew of languages, accents, and smells. Walk through the market and you'd hear Arabic, Greek, Italian, maybe even some rough English from a wandering ship's crew. And along with the goods came ideas. Stories of faraway places. Rumors of wars. Tales of miraculous spices that could cure every illness. Spoiler, they could not. Venice thrived on this constant chatter, half-truths mixed with half-spices, floating on the canals like perfume. Meanwhile, ordinary Venetians went about their days. Fishermen hauled in catches from the lagoon. Bakers rose before dawn to heat their ovens. Artisans hammered away in cramped workshops, making everything from glass beads to gondola ornaments. Women scrubbed laundry in the canals, yelling at children who insisted on climbing dangerously close to the edges. And yes, the canals were the laundry water. Also the dishwashing water. Also the sewer. Venice smelled unique, to put it politely. Visitors from the north often described it with phrases like overwhelming, memorable, or the ever-classy absolutely awful. But Venetians didn't care. To them, it was just home. The city's rhythm wasn't all work, though. Venetians loved festivals, games, and music. Boats decked with lanterns glided through the canals on special occasions. Bells rang from every church tower, and musicians played lutes on bridges. Evenings often ended with singing drifting across the water, sometimes beautiful, sometimes less so after too much cheap wine. Picture yourself lying in bed, shutters open to the night air. The canal below ripples quietly. From somewhere nearby, a group of gondoliers sing a tune as they row home. From further away, you hear laughter and clapping from a tavern. And mingling with it all, the steady toll of a church bell marking the hour. Venice was never truly silent. It murmured constantly, like the city itself was whispering in its sleep. And of course, we have to mention Venetian fashion. Because if you lived here, you were always on display. Everyone arrived by boat, everyone walked the same narrow streets, everyone gossiped constantly. So yes, people dressed to impress. Long robes, colorful fabrics, extravagant hats. The rich flaunted silks and jewels imported from afar. The poor copied the styles as best they could with cheaper cloth. There was even a time when Venice had to pass laws restricting luxury clothing. Too many people were bankrupting themselves trying to look fabulous at the market. Which, honestly, feels very relatable. Who among us hasn't made a bad purchase just to keep up appearances? But beneath the fashion and the singing, there was always a sense of unease. Venice was wealthy, yes, but it was also precarious. Built on mud. Dependent on trade routes that could shift. Surrounded by rivals who wanted a piece of the pie. Which might explain why Venetians threw themselves so fiercely into gossip, festivals, and display. If your city could literally sink, you might as well look good while it lasts. So let's pause here, floating in the middle of a quiet canal at dusk. The water ripples softly. A gondolier hums, steering his boat lazily through the shadows. Two women lean out of a window above, exchanging gossip in low voices. A merchant argues on the dock, waving his arms dramatically about the price of pepper. A dog barks, a child laughs, a bell tolls. And through it all, the water murmurs, steady and calm. That was daily life in Venice. A city where streets were rivers, neighbors were gossip artists, and the soundtrack was always water plus bells. Not dramatic. Not fast. Just endlessly murmuring, like a lullaby in stone and tide. So far, we've floated past gondoliers, gossiping neighbors, and markets that smell faintly of fish and ambition. But Venice wasn't just a quirky water city. It was also one of the greatest marketplaces of the medieval and early modern world. And that meant one thing above all else: money. Venice was rich. Obscenely rich. The kind of rich where even their pigeons probably strutted around feeling superior. And it all came down to trade. The big prize? Spices. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, nutmeg. Tiny plants from faraway places that made European food taste like something other than boiled sadness. Spices were gold dust in the kitchens of Europe's elites. Everyone wanted them, nobody nearby could grow them, and Venice figured out how to control the flow. Ships sailed east, through the Mediterranean, picking up spices from Arab and Indian merchants who had carried them along the Silk Road. Venice then turned around and sold those spices to Europe at a spectacular markup. It was basically medieval reselling. Buy wholesale in bulk, slap on a shiny price tag, and watch nobles empty their purses because they simply had to sprinkle cinnamon on their stewed pears. But it wasn't just spices. Venice dealt in everything: silks, glass, wine, wheat, metals, even timber. Yes, the city with no trees somehow became a hub for lumber. They imported raw wood from the Balkans, because you can't build ships out of soggy lagoon reeds, no matter how creative you get. And ships were everything. The Venetian arsenal, their massive shipyard, could turn out vessels on an industrial scale. Imagine a medieval assembly line, except instead of cars, it was galleys. Hundreds of craftsmen worked there, hammering, sawing, and occasionally swearing loudly at crooked planks. It was the heartbeat of Venice's power. Now, with wealth came awkwardness. Venetian merchants weren't knights or noble warriors. They didn't conquer lands in shining armor. They conquered markets with contracts, double-entry bookkeeping, and suspiciously one-sided trade agreements. Not exactly the stuff of epic poetry. And yet, they were incredibly proud of it. In a world where most elites claimed their honor came from battle, Venice proudly said, "Actually, we're businessmen." Which, let's be honest, made them sound like the smug finance bros of the Middle Ages. But hey, it worked. The city itself reflected this wealth. The palaces along the Grand Canal weren't just homes, they were statements. Each facade was like a PowerPoint presentation in stone: columns from Byzantium, mosaics from the East, Gothic arches borrowed from everywhere at once. The message was clear: we travel, we trade, we buy expensive things, and yes, we're better than you. Inside, these palaces were stuffed with imported luxuries: Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, embroidered silks. Imagine sitting down to dinner and casually resting your elbows on a tablecloth that cost more than a farmer's entire yearly income. Venetians didn't do subtle. They did show-off chic, Lagoon edition. And of course, with money came gossip. Everyone wanted to know who had landed the biggest shipment of spices, who had cornered the pepper market, who had accidentally bought a cargo of moldy cloves and was now pretending it was intentional. Merchants ruined each other's reputations with rumors. Oh, Giacomo? Yes, very wealthy. But did you hear his saffron shipment was fake? The Rialto Bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was basically the Wall Street of Venice. Merchants gathered there to swap news, haggle over deals, and loudly complain about tariffs. And because Venice was Venice, the whole financial system was floating above water. Banks sat next to canals, moneylenders rowed across to collect debts, and the city's financial heartbeat was as wet as everything else. But for all their wealth, Venetians were practical. They didn't waste time pretending they were saints. Unlike other European elites who cloaked themselves in knightly virtue while secretly hoarding gold, Venice openly admitted, yes, we're in it for the money. They built treaties, marriages, and even wars around trade. Take the Fourth Crusade, for example. Venice agreed to transport crusaders to the Holy Land, for a fee. When the crusaders couldn't pay, Venice shrugged and redirected them to sack Constantinople instead. It was one of history's biggest bait-and-switch operations, and Venice walked away with piles of loot and bragging rights. Crusading, Venetian style. Of course, not everyone loved this. Venice gained a reputation as sly, greedy, and untrustworthy. Other powers called them scheming merchants, slippery as eels. And to be fair, Venice leaned into it. They cultivated an image of mystery and cunning. Better to be feared as clever traders than dismissed as swamp dwellers. And the awkward wealth just kept growing. Families built fortunes that lasted for generations. Daughters were married off with dowries so heavy they needed boatloads of silver. Sons inherited trade networks stretching from Egypt to London. And while the rest of Europe stumbled through famines and wars, Venice quietly counted its coins. But here's the thing. Wealth in Venice wasn't just about luxury. It was survival. A city in a lagoon couldn't feed itself. It couldn't raise armies of knights. Its power came entirely from trade. If the ships stopped, if the spices dried up, Venice would sink, figuratively, if not literally. So the merchant's obsession with profit wasn't greed for greed's sake. It was necessity, dressed up in velvet robes. Now let's slow down and picture the market at dusk. The stalls are closing. The air smells of salt, cinnamon, and fish. Merchants count their coins by candlelight, eyes darting suspiciously at their neighbors. Gondolas slide past, laden with sacks of grain or barrels of wine. A banker hurries home, clutching a leather pouch. And above it all, the bells of San Marco toll, echoing across the water like a reminder that yes, time is still passing, even in this strange, floating marketplace. Venice was money, murmured into existence one spice, one coin, one whispered deal at a time. By now, we've drifted past gondoliers humming in the canals, merchants counting coins in the markets, and warehouses stacked with cinnamon and saffron. But wealth alone doesn't explain Venice. Somebody had to run this city. And Venice, being Venice, didn't do politics the normal way. No kings. No emperors. Just committees. So many committees. Venice was basically run by bureaucracy, centuries before paperwork became the modern nightmare we know today. The official head of the Republic was the Doge, which, despite sounding like a meme, was actually the most prestigious title in Venice. Picture an elderly man in a tall, weird hat that looked suspiciously like a golden slipper turned upside down. That was the Doge. He lived in the lavish Doge's palace on the edge of Piazza San Marco, wore brocade robes heavy enough to suffocate him, and was technically the ruler of Venice. But here's the catch: the Doge didn't really rule. He presided. He nodded. He looked ceremonial while everyone else did the actual work. Venice's government made sure of that. They deliberately clipped the Doge's wings because they didn't trust anyone with too much power. After all, they lived in a swamp. They weren't about to gamble their survival on one guy with bad judgment and an even worse hat. Instead, Venice ran on councils. The Great Council, the Senate, the Council of 10, yes, 10 people, though somehow they managed to micromanage the entire republic. Layers of bureaucracy stacked on top of each other like soggy lasagna. Every decision required discussion, voting, more discussion, and, inevitably, gossip. If you thought your office meetings were tedious, just imagine Venetian politics. And yet, this system worked. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but it worked. Venice avoided the dynastic meltdowns that plagued so many European kingdoms. No Habsburg jawlines here, just endless debates about tariffs and naval contracts. Of course, behind all the councils were the families. Merchant dynasties like the Mocenegos, the Contorinis, the Dandalos. These families practically wallpapered the city with their names. Their palaces lined the canals, their sons filled government posts, their daughters made strategic marriages. It was a game of prestige, influence, and making sure everyone knew just how important your lineage was. A Venetian noble family's palace wasn't just a home, it was a billboard. The facade screamed wealth, the windows glittered, the floors inside groaned under imported carpets and marble. Hosting dinners was less about eating and more about making rivals choke on envy. Oh, is that silk from Damascus on your walls? How quaint. We just redecorated with frescoes by the hottest artist from Florence. But Venetian politics had its quirks. Nobility wasn't quite the same as in other places. You couldn't just buy your way in, at least, not officially. Families were listed in the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book, which was essentially Venice's exclusive club membership list. If your family's name was in it, congratulations, you were a patrician. If not, tough luck. And unlike in monarchies, you couldn't simply marry your way to the top. The patriciate was tightly guarded. Families watched each other closely, making sure no outsiders slipped in. Venice was a closed club, run by merchants who pretended they were modest servants of the Republic while quietly swimming in gold. Now, about the Doge's job, it wasn't easy. Sure, it looked glamorous, parades, ceremonies, festivals, but it was also restrictive. A Doge couldn't leave the city without permission. He couldn't open mail privately. He couldn't even decorate his house however he wanted without council approval. Imagine being ruler of Venice and needing committee consent to repaint your bedroom. And when a Doge died, things got even weirder. His funeral was an enormous public spectacle, paid for by the state, with lavish processions and mournful bells. But before his body was cold, officials marched into his palace, seized his personal papers, and audited his entire life. If they found evidence he'd skimmed a little too much profit during his reign, which, let's be honest, they often did, his heirs could be fined. Nothing like ending your career with a posthumous tax audit. The Council of Ten deserves a special whisper. They were like Venice's secret service and internal police rolled into one. Ostensibly, they kept the Republic safe. In practice, they were nosy, ruthless, and very fond of anonymous tip-offs. Around the city, you'd find stone lion mouths, Bocchi di Leone, where citizens could drop anonymous accusations. "Dear Council of Ten, I think my neighbor is smuggling spices." Or, more likely, "My neighbor looked at me funny, please investigate." The Council of Ten loved this system. They sifted through accusations, punished conspiracies, and generally made sure everyone knew Venice was watching. Paranoid? Absolutely. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. The city avoided the constant rebellions that rocked other Italian states. Instead, it quietly hummed along, ruled by committees and lion-mouth mailboxes. All of this gave Venice a reputation. Outsiders described it as mysterious, calculating, even sinister. A city where masks were common, and not just at Carnival, where government worked in shadows, where families pulled strings behind closed doors. To the rest of Europe, Venice looked like a lagoon of scheming merchants in fancy robes. And honestly, they weren't wrong. But let's slow down and picture it more gently. A palazzo on the Grand Canal at dusk. Lamps glowing in tall arched windows. Servants bustling inside, laying out a banquet of fish, bread, and, of course, overpriced spices. The family sits around, discussing trade deals, marriage alliances, and whether young Marco should be sent off to study in Padua or kept home to mind the accounts. Outside, gondolas drift by, their silhouettes reflected in the water. And above it all, the bells of San Marco toll once again, echoing across the lagoon. Politics in Venice wasn't about dramatic speeches or thrones of gold. It was about whispered negotiations, committee votes, and endless dinners where the wine flowed just fast enough to keep the arguments polite. Slow, steady, calculated, like the city itself. And that's the strange charm of Venetian politics. No great kings. No dramatic coups. Just families in palaces, councils in chambers, and a doge in a silly hat, all keeping the lagoon afloat through sheer stubbornness and spreadsheets. So far, we've floated through daily life, markets, and the strange committee politics that somehow kept Venice afloat. But Venice wasn't only a city of merchants and gossip. It was also a city of rituals. Ceremonies, processions, festivals, and endless bells. Always the bells. Religion in Venice was a performance art. Which makes sense. This was a city that thrived on display. They couldn't just pray quietly. They had to put on a show. The jewel of it all was St. Mark's Basilica. That glittering, Byzantine-style cathedral squatting next to the Doge's palace, covered in mosaics that shimmered like gold in the lagoon light. Inside, the marble floors undulated like waves, because, yes, even the basilica was sinking just a little. But that didn't stop it from dazzling anyone who walked in. And the Venetians were very proud of their mascot, Street Mark. He wasn't originally theirs, of course. His relics were stolen from Alexandria in the 9th century, smuggled in barrels under layers of pork fat to trick Muslim customs inspectors. Because if you're going to commit holy theft, might as well do it creatively. From then on, Venice claimed St. Mark as its patron, complete with his symbol, the winged lion, plastered absolutely everywhere. But religion in Venice wasn't only about saints and basilicas. It was also about rituals that blended politics, faith, and theatre. The most famous was the marriage of the sea. Every year, the Doge would sail out into the lagoon on a massive golden barge called the Bucentaur. Surrounded by clergy, nobles, and musicians, he would toss a golden ring into the water, declaring Venice spiritually wedded to the sea. Because nothing says romance like marrying a large body of brackish water. The ritual was symbolic, of course, Venice acknowledging that the sea gave it life and wealth. But it was also a flex. The procession glittered with banners, music, incense, and finery. Outsiders watched in awe. Locals gossiped about who tripped on the deck. And the Doge got to throw jewelry into the lagoon, which, let's be honest, might have been the most fun part of his job. Festivals filled the Venetian calendar. There was Carnival, the most famous, when masks came out and the city turned into a chaotic masquerade. For weeks, people wore elaborate disguises, some to party anonymously, others to conduct affairs, and many simply to eat pastries without judgment. Masks freed Venetians from the constant surveillance of their small, crowded city. Behind a mask, you could be anyone, or no one at all. Carnival wasn't wild in the modern nightclub sense. It was a slow swirl of music, theatre, gambling, dancing, and parades. Gondolas lit with lanterns glided through the canals at night. Jugglers and musicians entertained crowds in the piazzas. Nobles in silk cloaks mingled with artisans in simpler masks. Everyone pretending, just for a little while, that the city's rigid social hierarchy had loosened. Of course, behind the scenes, the Council of Ten was still keeping a very close eye on things. Nothing says anonymous fun like knowing the state's secret police might be behind the next mask. Other rituals were quieter but no less strange. When plague struck the city, which it did, often, Venice responded not just with quarantines but with church building. After one particularly devastating plague in the 16th century, they built the Church of Illinois Redentor. The city held processions to it every year, crossing the lagoon on temporary floating bridges of boats. Imagine thousands of people shuffling across a chain of gondolas, praying for deliverance, while the water murmured beneath their feet. It was solemn, but also strangely beautiful. A reminder that even in disaster, Venice turned to ritual, pageantry, and, of course, more construction projects. Religion also wove into daily rhythms. Every neighborhood had its parish church, with bells ringing out the hours. Festivals honored local saints, complete with processions of relics carried through narrow streets. Children followed, shouting, dogs barked, gondoliers paused to watch from the water. These weren't quiet affairs, they were noisy, communal, half-prayer and half-street party. And then there were the scuole, Venice's lay brotherhoods. Not exactly churches, not exactly charities, but something in between. Members gathered for religious devotion, but also to fund hospitals, help the poor, and put on impressive processions. Each scuola had its own hall, decorated with paintings that were anything but sleepy. Tintoretto's canvases stretched across ceilings, glowing with biblical drama, while members sat beneath them in their robes, quietly organizing food distributions. The scuole showed Venice's peculiar blend of piety and pragmatism. Religion wasn't just about saving your soul, it was about keeping society orderly, caring for the needy, and, naturally, showing off how generous your family could afford to be. But for all the pageantry, Venice's religion had a shadowy side. The city's wealth rested on trade with the Muslim world, even while the church wagged its finger. So Venetians developed a habit of selective piety. They paraded saints in public, but quietly cut deals with Cairo and Constantinople in private. God on Sunday, prophet on Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday. This balancing act sometimes gave Venice a reputation for cynicism. Outsiders grumbled that Venetians used religion as stagecraft, while in reality they worshipped only gold. And, well, they weren't entirely wrong. Still, the rituals mattered. To the people of Venice, they gave rhythm to life in a city where time was otherwise marked only by tides and trade. Bells announced dawn, noon, and evening. Festivals punctuated the year with color and laughter. Processions filled the streets with incense and music. Even the marriage of the sea, absurd as it sounds, gave Venetians a sense of identity, that they were not just a city, but a people bound to the lagoon. So let's pause here and picture it. The lagoon at dawn. The Bucentaur glides out across the water, banners fluttering, the Doge in his shimmering robes holding a ring. Priests chant, incense drifts, the crowd watches silently from the shore. He throws the ring into the sea, it vanishes with a splash, and the bells of San Marco ring out, echoing across the canals. Or picture Carnival at night. Lanterns glowing, masks glittering, gondolas sliding through the dark water. Laughter spilling from taverns, music weaving through narrow alleys, shadows dancing on the walls. A city where identity itself became fluid, as shifting as the water beneath your feet. That was Venice. A city of rituals, always balancing piety with pageantry, faith with performance, and devotion with just a little bit of profit on the side. By day, Venice was noise. Merchants arguing at the Rialto, gondoliers gossiping as they rode, bells clanging from every tower, and markets that smelled like 10 different spices plus one unfortunate fish stall. But by night, Venice shifted. The The water darkened, the lamps flickered, and the city took on a hushed, almost conspiratorial mood. Venice at night wasn't silent, exactly. It murmured. Oars dipped into water, soft and steady. Voices carried strangely over the canals, low conversations from windows, faint songs from gondolas, the occasional drunken shout from a tavern. But everything was softened, blurred, like the city itself was whispering instead of speaking. Let's drift into those nights for a while. Picture yourself lying in bed in a creaky wooden house, shutters open. The canal below ripples with moonlight. From somewhere nearby, a violin plays. Yes, Venice was obsessed with violins long before Vivaldi made it official. The sound floats across the water, mingling with the faint splash of an oar. And just when you're about to fall asleep, a group of revelers stumbles home, masks still half on from carnival, laughing loudly about some joke you'll never hear. That was Venice after dark. Never fully quiet. Always a little mysterious. And mystery was part of its charm. This was a city built on water, which meant shadows moved strangely. Lantern light danced on the rippling canals, stretching shapes across walls and bridges. Narrow alleys twisted suddenly, leading you into dead ends or dropping you at the edge of silent water. Even locals could get lost, especially at night. Which, of course, made Venice the perfect backdrop for secrets. And Venice loved secrets. The Republic practically ran on them. The Council of Ten, remember them from earlier, thrived on whispers and anonymous tips. Citizens could slip accusations into the stone lion mouths, those bocchi di leone scattered around the city. My neighbor is smuggling pepper. My cousin is plotting against the Doge. Or more likely, my rival cheated me at dice. Venice encouraged it all, just to keep people on edge. So imagine wandering past one of those lion mouths at night. The stone face staring blankly, its mouth open for secret notes. You'd walk a little faster, wondering who had dropped in an accusation that day, and who might be quietly investigated tomorrow. Sleep well, Venice. And then there was decay. Not sudden, but slow and steady, like the tide itself. Venice had always been precarious, built on mud, held up by wooden piles, surrounded by water that constantly threatened to reclaim it. By the 16th and 17th centuries, cracks were showing. Trade routes shifted. New Atlantic powers like Spain, Portugal, and later the Dutch started dominating global trade. Venice, stuck in the Mediterranean, watched helplessly as spices bypassed its markets. The lagoon city that once controlled the flow of cinnamon and pepper now felt sidelined. But Venice didn't collapse dramatically. It faded. Slowly. Wealth dwindled, palaces aged, canals grew muddier. And yet, the city still pretended. Families still threw lavish banquets. Gondoliers still sang. The Doge still tossed his ring into the sea every year. It was like an aging actor refusing to leave the stage, insisting the show must go on even as the audience drifted away. Music softened the decline. Venice became famous for it. Choirs in St. Mark's Basilica filled the golden domes with sound. Composers like Monteverdi and later Vivaldi turned the city into a music capital. Wealthy families sponsored concerts, filling their palaces with lutes, violins, and harpsichords. Even as trade waned, music flourished. Picture an evening in the 17th century. A small chamber concert in a crumbling palazzo. Guests recline on brocade chairs while musicians play by candlelight. The plaster on the ceiling is cracked, the marble floors are chipped, but the music soars, echoing across the canal outside. Decay and beauty, side by side. That was late Venice in a nutshell. And speaking of side by side, Venice was also a city where life and death mingled closely. Plague struck often. Every few decades, the city was hit with waves of disease that killed thousands. Gondolas became funeral boats, carrying the dead across the lagoon to islands where graves were dug. Yet even then, rituals continued. Survivors marched in processions, lit candles, and built churches in thanks. Life went on, even in the shadow of death. So at night, in the quiet, Venetians must have listened to the water and wondered how long their city could last. How long the piles would hold. How long the trade would flow. How long the marble palaces would stand before the lagoon swallowed them back. And yet, There was resilience in the quiet. Even in decline, Venice remained Venice, murmuring, glittering faintly, stubbornly refusing to vanish. The canals still carried gondolas. The bells still rang. Music still drifted through the night air. Decay was inevitable, but it was graceful, almost sleepy, in its own way. So let's pause here, floating in the lagoon under the stars. The city is hushed, the water gleams darkly. Somewhere, a violin plays softly. A gondolier hums. A candle flickers in a window, then goes out. The stone walls are damp, the wooden piles creak, the palaces sag slightly. But Venice still murmurs. Always murmurs. That was the quieter Venice. Nights, shadows, secrets, and slow decay. A city that seemed to whisper its own lullaby, even as it drifted toward the end of its golden age. So, we floated through Venice in its brightness. The markets buzzing with spices, the palaces glittering on the Grand Canal, the festivals blazing with masks and lanterns. We've drifted through its quieter side, too, shadows, secrets, music echoing softly at night. And now, as we close, it's time to let the city fade. Slowly, quietly, the way Venice itself did. By the 18th century, Venice was no longer the powerhouse it had once been. The great trade empires had shifted west. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, and then the British were busy hauling spices directly from Asia, leaving Venice's warehouses quieter than they'd been in centuries. The lagoon city that once held Europe's purse strings now found itself selling nostalgia. Venetians pivoted. If they couldn't dominate trade, they would dominate style. The city became Europe's pleasure capital. Visitors came not for spices, but for music, gambling, and carnival. Masked balls filled the palaces, gambling houses stayed open till dawn, and the air grew thick with perfume, wine, and the faint whiff of decline. It was beautiful, decadent, and just a little tragic. Like watching an aging star still dazzling on stage, even as the curtain slowly lowers. By night, Venice glimmered with candles and laughter. By day, the cracks showed. Palaces sagged, plaster peeled, canals grew sluggish with silt. The city was sinking, literally. Every year, the lagoon nibbled a little higher at its foundations. Venetians patched, repaired, and carried on, because that's what Venetians had always done. And yet, they never stopped the rituals. The Doge still threw his ring into the sea. The bells still rang from San Marco. The gondoliers still rode, humming the same old songs. Even as power slipped away, the city clung to its identity with quiet stubbornness. Visitors in the 18th century described Venice with a mix of awe and melancholy. They marveled at the glittering palaces, the glowing basilica, the endless festivals. But they also whispered about the emptiness behind the glamour. A city coasting on memory. A floating stage set, beautiful but fragile. And maybe that's what made Venice so haunting. Other empires collapsed in fire and battle. Venice just faded. Slowly, gently, like a candle burning lower, flickering, then finally settling into smoke. But here's the thing. Venice never truly disappeared. Even in its decline, it stayed alive. The gondolas still slid through the canals. The pigeons still strutted across Piazza San Marco. The lagoon still murmured against its stone walls. The city kept going, not as a conqueror or a trader, but as itself. And centuries later, it's still there. The bells still ring. The canals still ripple. Tourists crowd the bridges, yes, but beneath the noise, the old Venice still whispers, the same murmurs that lulled people to sleep 500 years ago. So let's let Venice settle now, in our minds, into the twilight. Picture it at dusk. The Grand Canal glowing in the last light of the sun. Palaces casting long shadows across the water. Gondolas drifting silently. A church bell ringing slowly, echoing out across the lagoon. The city is quieter now. The merchants are gone, the doges long buried, the palaces sagging with age. But the water still moves, the stones still stand, and the whispers still carry in the night air. Venice is a reminder that even the grandest things fade, not with explosions, but with murmurs. And sometimes, that's the most beautiful ending of all.